My wife lay hooked to machines in a silent hospital room while her parents pointed their manicured fingers at me and told the police I was the one who put her there. I carried their blame and the world's hatred for 18 agonizing days. But they made one fatal mistake. They did not know my wife had installed a secret DASHCAM in her car, and that tiny piece of plastic was about to expose the terrifying reason they needed me locked in a prison cell before she ever opened her eyes. The fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit hummed with a sick, sterile energy. I stood beside the hospital bed, my hands trembling as I stared at my wife. Claire was 34 years old, vibrant and full of life, just 24 hours ago. Now she was hidden beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling only because a mechanical ventilator forced air into her lungs. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. The smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol burned my nose. My name is Tom Gallagher. I am 36 years old, and for the past 10 years I have taught American history at a local public high school. I loved my wife with every fiber of my being. I worked hard, paid my taxes, and went to church on Sundays. But the family I married into always saw me as a disease they needed to cure. The heavy wooden doors of the intensive care unit suddenly swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. I turned, expecting to see a doctor or a nurse carrying the latest brain scan results. Instead, Richard and Patricia Sterling marched into the room. These were Claire's parents, the absolute crown royalty of our local country club. Richard wore a tailored navy suit that easily cost more than I made in 2 full months of teaching. Patricia clutched a designer leather handbag tightly to her chest, her blonde hair perfectly sprayed and styled. They did not look like parents who had just received a phone call saying their daughter was in a coma. Patricia did not rush to the side of the bed. She did not weep or call out her daughter's name. There was no grief in their posture. Their faces were set in stone cold and aggressively calculating, and they were not alone. Flanking them were 2 large uniformed police detectives, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Before I could even speak, before I could take a single step forward to offer a comforting embrace to my grieving in-laws, Richard raised his arm. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. His voice was loud, authoritative, and perfectly rehearsed, shattering the fragile quiet of the hospital room. He looked at the detectives and declared that the man standing by the bed was a monster. Richard looked right through me and told the police that Claire and I had engaged in a vicious screaming match the night before. He claimed Claire was planning to file for divorce, that she had finally realized my pathetic teacher salary was dragging down her highly successful real estate agency. He painted me as a financial parasite who refused to let go of his golden goose. Then Richard delivered the lie that would completely destroy my life. He looked the lead detective in the eye and claimed I had tampered with the brakes on Claire's sport utility vehicle out of sheer jealousy and rage. He said I knew she had to drive down the steep mountain pass that morning to appraise a luxury property, and that I wanted her dead rather than lose my access to her money. The words hit me like physical blows to the stomach. My mind spun in utter blinding disbelief. I tried to speak, to tell the police that Richard was insane, and that none of this was true. Claire and I had spent the previous evening laughing in our kitchen, packing our bags for a romantic weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast. We had just celebrated our 7th wedding anniversary. My mind flashed back to the day we got married at their pristine, massive community church. I remembered Richard standing at the reception, using his father of the bride toast to remind the entire congregation of wealthy real estate developers that he was paying for the catering because a public school teacher could never afford to treat his daughter to a proper life. He had hated my lack of status since day one, but accusing me of attempted murder while my wife lay fighting for her life mere inches away was a level of pure evil I could not even process. I shook my head, my vision blurring with panicked tears. I reached out blindly toward the hospital bed, desperate to hold Claire's hand, needing just one physical touch from her to ground me in this living nightmare. I needed her to wake up and tell them it was a lie. As my fingers grazed her pale, cold skin, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder with terrifying force. One of the detectives spun me around, kicking my legs apart. He slammed me hard against the pale blue hospital wall, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. My cheek pressed against the cold drywall as he wrenched my arms behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, the metal biting into my skin. Patricia leaned in close as the detective patted me down. Her voice was a venomous whisper meant only for me. She told me I was a pathetic loser who had finally ruined everything and that she would make sure I rotted in a prison cell for the rest of my miserable life. I was yanked backward by the heavy chain of the handcuffs. I struggled, begging the doctors and nurses who had gathered in the hallway to help me, but they just stared in silent shock. The detectives marched me through the brightly lit hospital corridors and out the automatic glass doors into the blinding morning sun. As I was shoved aggressively toward the back of a waiting police cruiser, I looked up. Standing on the sidewalk, leaning casually against a black luxury car, was my brother-in-law, Trent Sterling. Trent was a slick, highly paid corporate lawyer who treated the world like a game he always won. As the detective pushed my head down into the police car, I locked eyes with Trent. He did not look concerned for his sister. Instead, he flashed me a chilling, victorious smirk. The door slammed shut, trapping me in the dark, and my descent into hell officially began. The cold steel dug into my wrists with a sharp, unforgiving bite. One of the detectives gripped my bicep, hauling me physically away from the hospital bed. I twisted my neck, fighting the officer's grip just to keep my eyes on Claire for one more second. Her pale face remained perfectly still beneath the plastic oxygen mask. The steady hiss and click of her mechanical ventilator grew fainter as the police dragged me out of the intensive care unit and into the brightly lit corridor. Every step felt like trying to walk underwater. My brain simply refused to accept the reality of what was happening. Yesterday morning, Claire and I were sitting at our small kitchen table, laughing about our weekend plans and sharing a pot of cheap coffee. Today, I was being hauled away like a violent predator. The officers did not gently guide me. They moved with aggressive, rigid purpose, treating me exactly like the monster my father-in-law claimed I was. The heavy doors of the intensive care ward swung shut behind me, completely severing my connection to my wife. I begged the detectives to stop. I pleaded with them to check the local traffic cameras, to pull our cellular phone records, to just talk to anyone who actually knew the two of us. They ignored every single word I said. The taller detective simply shoved me forward, his thick fingers bruising my arm through my flannel shirt. We reached the sprawling main lobby of the hospital. It was a massive, open atrium filled with discharged patients visiting families holding balloons, doctors reviewing charts, and nurses pushing medical carts. The sheer volume of people made my stomach drop. This was exactly the audience Patricia Sterling wanted. She had followed us out of the private ward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum floor. She did not walk like a mother paralyzed by the tragic car crash of her youngest daughter. She walked like a ruthless prosecutor executing a flawless closing argument in a crowded courtroom. As the detectives marched me past the central reception desk, Patricia unleashed her fury. She threw her hands into the air and let out a piercing theatrical sob that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the massive room. "Look at him!" she screamed, pointing her manicured finger at my handcuffed wrists. "Look at the parasite who tried to murder my daughter." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire hospital lobby. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People froze in their tracks. Strangers stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. I felt my face burn with a shame so deep and toxic it made me physically nauseous. "You could not stand that she was outgrowing your pathetic little life," Patricia shrieked, matching her pace to the police officers. "You are a jealous, weak man. You tampered with her brakes because if you could not feed off her money, no one could. Murderer. You are a murderer." I kept my head down, staring intently at the scuffed toes of my work boots. If I spoke, if I desperately tried to defend myself to these strangers, it would only make the horrific scene uglier. The hospital security guards quickly scrambled to clear a path toward the main exit, treating me like an active threat to public safety. Every step toward those automatic sliding doors felt like a public march to the gallows. And beneath the sheer shock of the arrest, a dark, terrifying realization began to take root in my mind. Patricia was not reacting blindly to a sudden tragedy. She was finally unleashing 10 years of bottled-up disgust. The Sterling family never once tried to hide their absolute contempt for my existence. I was a public high school history teacher. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood raised by a mechanic and a diner waitress. I drove a 12-year-old sedan, brought my lunch to work in a paper bag, and bought my suits off the clearance rack. Claire, on the other hand, was their golden child. She ran one of the most lucrative luxury real estate agencies in the entire state, closing multi-million-dollar commercial deals before she even turned 30. Richard and Patricia had spent our entire marriage actively trying to convince Claire that I was a financial anchor, tied heavily around her neck. They genuinely believed my modest income and total lack of corporate ambition were infectious diseases that would eventually ruin her elite brand. They actively excluded me from their country club dinners. They constantly introduced Claire to single wealthy investors right in front of me at charity events. But Claire never cared about their elitist world. She fiercely protected me. She loved my quiet, steady life. But now, with Claire lying unconscious and broken on a hospital bed, my only shield was gone. They were seizing this horrific tragedy to rip me out of her life by force. The automatic glass doors of the lobby finally parted. The harsh morning sunlight blinded me for a second as the detectives pushed me out onto the concrete drop-off zone. A marked police cruiser sat waiting by the curb, its red and blue lights flashing silently against the brick exterior of the hospital. The detective forcefully pushed my head down, maneuvering my tall frame into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. Before he slammed the heavy door shut, I looked up through the smudged window. Standing alone on the sidewalk, casually leaning against the polished hood of a brand-new black luxury vehicle, was my brother-in-law, Trent Sterling. Trent was a high-powered corporate attorney who made his living crushing small businesses and legally hiding assets for wealthy clients. He wore a pristine gray tailored suit, his posture completely relaxed. He was not looking at the hospital doors. He was looking directly at me. As our eyes locked through the police cruiser window, Trent did not show a single ounce of grief, panic, or confusion over his sister. Instead, the corner of his mouth slowly curled upward. He gave me a cold, calculated, and perfectly victorious smirk. In that terrifying fraction of a second, the absolute truth hit me with the force of a freight train. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a flawless, legally binding execution. And then the heavy door slammed shut, trapping me in the dark. The interrogation room was exactly as suffocating as television makes it out to be. It was an airless, windowless concrete box specifically designed to break a man down and strip away his spirit. A single fluorescent fixture buzzed aggressively overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the scratched surface of a heavy metal table. I had been sitting in that rigid, unforgiving chair for what felt like an eternity. A digital clock mounted on the far wall confirmed it had been 8 excruciating hours since the police had dragged me out of the hospital lobby. 8 hours of relentless, overlapping questions. 8 hours of being treated like a violent predator while my wife was lying in an intensive care unit breathing through a plastic tube. 2 detectives took turns pacing the cramped space. The older one, a heavy-set man named Miller, used intimidation. His younger partner, Davis, played the quiet, analytical observer. They did not offer me a glass of water. They did not allow me a phone call to secure legal counsel. They simply fired continuous accusations at my face, trying to trip up my timeline, desperately searching for a single crack in my story. But I had absolutely nothing to hide. I kept repeating the simple, boring truth. I loved my wife. I was at the high school grading a stack of freshman history essays when the hospital administration called me about the horrific accident. My voice grew hoarse, my throat burning with severe dehydration and sheer unadulterated panic. My entire body ached from the rigid posture I was forced to maintain, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental torture of not knowing if Claire was going to survive the night. Detective Miller finally stopped pacing the floor. He let out a loud theatrical sigh, pulled a thick manila folder from his interior jacket pocket, and slammed it down onto the metal table with a deafening thud. He told me they were officially done playing games. With a quick, practiced flick of his wrist, he spread a series of glossy 8x10 photographs across the cold surface. My breath immediately hitched in my chest. Staring back at me were the terrifying high-resolution images of Claire's pristine luxury sport utility vehicle. It was completely crushed, sitting mangled at the muddy bottom of a steep, rocky mountain ravine. The front hood was violently caved in the airbags deployed, and the windshield shattered into a million glittering fragments. Looking at the twisted, unrecognizable metal, a wave of profound nausea hit me so hard, I thought I was going to be physically sick. I could not fathom how the woman I loved had even survived the initial impact. Then, Detective Davis leaned forward and slid one final photograph directly under my chin. It was a tight close-up shot of a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters resting in the dirt near the crash site. My heart skipped a sudden beat. Engraved deeply into the red rubber handle were two distinct letters, T and G. My initials. It was the exact pair of wire cutters I kept casually tossed in the open tool bench of my home garage. Miller leaned in closely, his heavy breath warm and stale against my face, and asked me how my personal tools ended up 20 miles outside of town at the exact spot where someone intentionally severed the brake lines of my wife's vehicle. He demanded to know why a man who claimed to love his wife would meticulously plan her brutal demise just to collect a life insurance payout. I stammered, shaking my head violently in disbelief. I told them my garage was always left unlocked, that anyone from the neighborhood could have easily walked in and taken those tools. It sounded like a weak, pathetic excuse even to my own ears, but it was the absolute reality of my suburban life. Davis just chuckled, a dry, entirely humorless sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He opened another file folder and began reading aloud from a stack of freshly typed police reports. He formally informed me that the department already possessed sworn witness statements from two prominent, highly respected members of our local community, Richard and Trent Sterling. My father-in-law and my brother-in-law had willingly driven down to this very precinct and painted a terrifying, detailed portrait of my character. According to their sworn legal affidavits, I was a deeply insecure, violently unpredictable man who deeply resented his wife's massive financial success. They told the police I was financially abusing Claire, slowly draining her business accounts to fund a secret, escalating gambling habit. Trent had even provided a meticulously fabricated account of a physical altercation between Claire and me just 2 days prior. He claimed Claire had called him in hysterics, terrified of my explosive temper, and confessed that she was drawing up permanent divorce papers. The detectives looked at me with pure, unfiltered disgust. They believed every single word the wealthy, powerful Sterling men had fed them without a second of hesitation. To the police, a wealthy real estate developer and a high-powered corporate attorney were pillars of truth, while a public school teacher on a meager salary was the perfect textbook suspect for a crime of financial desperation. The sheer, unimaginable audacity of their lies temporarily paralyzed my vocal cords. When I finally found my voice, I slammed my handcuffed wrists against the table, the metal chain clanking loudly against the steel. I practically screamed at the detectives that Richard and Trent were lying through their teeth to frame me. I frantically explained that Claire and I were profoundly happy. We had spent the entire previous week enthusiastically planning a romantic anniversary trip to a coastal bed and breakfast. I begged them to look at my cellular phone, to read our loving text messages, to look at the vacation reservations I had booked and paid for with my own teaching salary. I pleaded with them to ask any of our neighbors or my colleagues at the high school to vouch for my character. I was a calm, predictable history teacher, not a calculating, violent mastermind. But as I watched Miller roll his eyes, and Davis jot down another dismissive note on his legal pad, a terrifying chill washed over my entire body. The stolen wire cutters left explicitly at the scene. The perfectly timed identical witness statements from her family. The coordinated ambush at the hospital while I was vulnerable. This was not a tragic misunderstanding or a simple rush to judgment by local law enforcement. The Sterling family had not just seized a random opportunity to kick me while I was down. They had meticulously orchestrated this entire false narrative. They needed me locked inside a concrete cell, stripped of my credibility and completely removed from Claire's life, long before she ever had the chance to wake up from her coma and tell the world the truth. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room groaned open. I braced my exhausted body for another brutal round of shouting from the detectives. My throat was completely raw from desperately pleading my innocence. My wrists were bruised a deep shade of purple from the incredibly tight metal handcuffs. But instead of Detective Miller returning with more fabricated photographs, a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. It was Trent. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase and wore a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. He looked over his shoulder at the two detectives standing in the hallway and introduced himself formally as the legal counsel acting on behalf of the Sterling family. In a soft, convincing tone, he requested a brief private moment with his brother-in-law. Trent claimed he simply wanted to see if he could talk some rational sense into me for the sake of his hospitalized sister. The detectives bought his theatrical performance completely. They nodded with deep respect, patted Trent sympathetically on the shoulder, and quietly exited the room. The heavy metal door clicked firmly shut, sealing the two of us inside. The absolute second the deadbolt engaged, the tragic brother routine vanished completely. Trent dropped his expensive briefcase onto the scratched metal table with a careless thud. He pulled out the steel chair opposite me, casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, and sat down. He leaned back and crossed his legs, looking at me as if I were a disgusting stain on the bottom of his Italian leather shoes. For a long and agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the aggressive buzz of the overhead light fixture. I glared at him. My heart hammered furiously against my ribs. I demanded to know what he was doing and why he and Richard were feeding the police absolute garbage. I told him they were going to ruin an innocent man. Trent did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply smiled. It was the same chilling and victorious smirk he had given me outside the hospital lobby. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold table. His voice dropped into a low, terrifying whisper. He told me that the truth did not matter in the slightest. He explained that reality was entirely subjective and belonged exclusively to the people who possessed the money to write the narrative. He reminded me with utter disdain that I was merely a high school history teacher pulling down barely $60,000 a year. He asked me how exactly I planned to defend myself against a fabricated mountain of physical evidence when I could not even afford to hire a basic paralegal, let alone a top-tier criminal defense attorney. I sat there in stunned silence as the sheer malice of his plan began to take shape. Trent laughed a dry, humorless laugh at my paralysis. He told me the American justice system was a brutal meat grinder designed specifically to chew up people exactly like me. People with no high-level connections, no generational wealth, and absolutely no leverage. He leaned in even closer, so close I could smell the expensive cologne on his collar. He whispered that he was going to make sure I went away for 25 years. He promised to personally oversee my entire prosecution from the wealthy shadows. He wanted me to rot in a concrete box while the Sterling family erased every single trace of my existence from Claire's life. I strained against the metal handcuffs. My entire body shook with profound, helpless rage. I told him he was completely out of his mind. I swore to him that when Claire finally woke up from her coma, she would expose every single lie they had manufactured. I reminded him that Claire loved me deeply and that her voice would completely destroy their coordinated legal ambush. Trent simply adjusted his expensive silk tie and stood up from the table. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He said I was incredibly naive for a man who taught American history. He told me that history was always written by the victors, and I had already lost the war without even realizing the battle had begun. He picked up his briefcase, knocked twice on the heavy steel door, and instantly slipped the mask of a grieving brother right back onto his face as the detectives walked back inside to resume their psychological torture. Several agonizing hours later, an overworked public defender finally arrived to represent me. She looked completely exhausted carrying a massive stack of worn folders, but she somehow managed to secure a sudden emergency bail hearing for me just before midnight. The judge looked at the horrific charges and set my bond at a truly staggering amount. To secure my temporary release, I had to authorize the immediate transfer of my entire life savings. Every single dollar I had quietly saved over the past 10 years of teaching was gone. A total of $12,000 meant for a down payment on a modest house for Claire and me was completely wiped out in a matter of seconds. I handed over my financial security just to buy my temporary freedom. I walked out of the police precinct a financially ruined man. The cold night air hit my face, bringing absolutely no relief to my racing mind. As I slowly walked down the long concrete steps of the station, carrying my wallet and keys in a clear plastic bag, I saw a familiar shape in the shadows. Trent was waiting by his luxury car near the curb. He stepped directly into my path, completely blocking the sidewalk. He leaned close to my ear, his voice slicing through the chilly evening wind. He whispered that draining my meager bank account was a pathetic waste of money. Then he delivered a promise that completely froze the blood in my veins. By the time she wakes up, you will not exist anymore. The drive away from the police precinct and back toward my own neighborhood was a surreal, sickening blur. The $12,000 I had just wired to the bail bondsman was originally supposed to be the down payment for a nursery room addition. Now it was simply the exorbitant price of a temporary pass out of a concrete cage. My hands gripped the worn steering wheel of my aging sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. Every single muscle in my back and shoulders screamed in agony from being forced to sit in that rigid interrogation chair for an entire day. All I desperately wanted was a hot shower, a change of clean clothes, and a quiet moment in my own living room to figure out exactly how to fight back against the monsters trying to steal my wife. But the Sterling family was always 3 steps ahead of me. As I turned the final corner onto our familiar, quiet suburban street, my headlights swept across the length of our concrete driveway. I slammed my foot on the brakes, throwing the car to a violent halt. Parked horizontally directly across the entrance of our home was a massive, heavily tinted black sport utility vehicle. 2 large men dressed in tactical black uniforms stood squarely on our manicured front lawn. Their arms were crossed aggressively over thick bulletproof vests. These were not local police officers conducting a routine neighborhood patrol. They were high-end private security contractors, the expensive, ruthless kind you hire when money is absolutely no object and you want to send a terrifying message. I threw my car into park, my legs feeling like blocks of solid lead as I stumbled out onto the cold pavement. I walked slowly up the incline of my own driveway, holding my metal house key out in front of me like a pathetic, useless peace offering. The larger of the 2 guards immediately stepped forward to intercept me. He placed a thick, heavily gloved hand squarely against my chest, physically stopping me from taking another single step toward my own front porch. I raised my voice, telling him to get out of my way immediately. I told him this was my house, my mortgage, and my property, and he had no legal right to stand on my grass. The guard did not even blink. His face remained a mask of cold-paid indifference. He simply raised a finger and pointed past me toward the front door. The beautiful vintage brass lock I had personally spent an entire weekend installing 2 years ago was completely gone. In its place was a heavy industrial-grade steel deadbolt. The front curtains were drawn incredibly tight. The motion sensor porch lights were glaringly bright, illuminating my complete failure. They had aggressively locked me out of the peaceful sanctuary Claire and I had painstakingly built together. I demanded loudly to know who gave them the authority to barricade a man from his own home. Before the security guard could offer a response, a third man stepped silently out from the deep stretching shadows of our large oak tree. He wore a cheap gray suit and carried a thick, aggressively stapled manila envelope in his hand. He asked in a flat, monotone voice to confirm my full legal name. The exact moment the confirmation left my dry lips, he shoved the heavy envelope directly into my chest with considerable force. He officially announced that I had been formally served, spun sharply on his heel, and walked quickly down the street toward his parked vehicle without looking back. I ripped the thick envelope open right there under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the security floodlights. The legal documents inside were a masterpiece of sheer weaponized cruelty. Trent had certainly not wasted a single second of his day. While I was rotting inside a windowless interrogation room fighting for my basic freedom, he had successfully fast-tracked an emergency temporary restraining order. He pushed it through a judge he probably played golf with at his exclusive country club every single weekend. The formal paperwork detailed a horrifying, entirely fabricated timeline of extreme domestic violence and escalating mental instability. It legally classified me as an immediate severe threat to public safety and to the physical well-being of my unconscious wife. The legal parameters established by Trent were absolute and completely suffocating. I was explicitly barred from coming within 1,000 feet of my own property boundaries. I was prohibited from attempting to access our joint business and personal bank accounts. But the final clause of the document was a serrated knife driven directly into my heart. Trent had successfully secured a judicial mandate permanently banning me from entering the entire medical campus where Claire was currently fighting for her life. If I stepped foot anywhere near her intensive care unit, the local hospital police were legally obligated to arrest me on site. That action would instantly revoke my expensive bail and send me straight into a maximum security county jail cell. The cold night air was knocked completely out of my lungs. I looked up from the terrifying legal documents and began to notice the subtle, agonizing movements in the houses surrounding mine. Porch lights began flicking on one by one. Heavy curtains parted slightly. Blinds were slowly pulled back by hidden hands. My neighbors, the very people I had hosted for summer backyard barbecues and cheerfully helped shovel snow during harsh winters, were actively watching me. But they were not looking at me with any form of pity, confusion, or concern. They were staring down at me with outright unadulterated disgust. Patricia Sterling had obviously not been idle while I was trapped downtown. While her son was busy manipulating the highest levels of the local legal system, Patricia had clearly launched a toxic, highly effective neighborhood gossip campaign. She had likely called every single person on this street, painting a tragic picture of her family while labeling me as a violent, unpredictable monster who finally snapped and put her precious daughter in a medically induced coma. The people I once genuinely considered my friends were now holding their glowing cell phones up to their living room windows, entirely prepared to dial emergency services the very second I raised my voice again. I was completely isolated. I was a dangerous, unwanted pariah standing alone on his own front lawn. The larger security guard tapped the radio on his shoulder and took another slow, intimidating step toward me. He casually rested his hand on his tactical utility belt and firmly suggested I return to my vehicle before he had to aggressively enforce the strict boundaries of the court order. I possessed absolutely no leverage in this situation. If I fought back, if I threw a punch, or even raised my voice, I would play exactly into the violent, unstable narrative they had so expertly crafted for the judge. I swallowed the bitter, acidic taste of utter defeat, lowered my head, and turned my back on the only home I had. I walked slowly and heavily back down the driveway toward my 12-year-old Honda Civic. The driver's side door creaked loudly in the quiet suburban night as I pulled it open. I climbed into the torn fabric seat and locked the doors completely, surrounded by the suffocating, terrifying silence of my new reality. My cellular phone was completely dead. My life savings account was entirely empty. I had zero access to clean clothes, a warm shower, or a safe, quiet place to simply close my eyes. I curled my long frame awkwardly into the cramped back seat of the small car, pulling my thin, unwashed jacket tightly around my shivering shoulders to block out the biting cold. Outside the frosted windows, the world kept moving, but my life had been entirely erased by the stroke of a pen. I closed my eyes tightly, picturing Claire lying completely alone in that sterile hospital room, completely surrounded by the very people who were actively trying to destroy us. I took a deep, shaky breath and prepared to spend my first night as a homeless, hunted man. The morning sun did not bring any warmth to the cramped back seat of my 12-year-old sedan. I woke up with my knees pressed tightly against my chest, every joint in my body screaming in stiff, agonizing protest. Frost had completely coated the inside of the windows, blurring the quiet suburban street where I had illegally parked overnight. I tried to sit up, my breath pluming in the freezing air, and rubbed my bruised wrists. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing weight of my reality. I had no home, no money, and no access to the woman I loved. I reached over the center console to grab my phone, praying for some kind of miraculous text message from a lawyer or a sympathetic detective. Instead, the screen lit up with an incoming call that would officially sever my last remaining tie to the world. The caller identification displayed the main office number for the high school where I had dedicated the last 10 years of my life. I answered with a dry, cracked voice. It was Principal David Harris. Under normal circumstances, David was a warm, supportive mentor who frequently praised my ability to make American history come alive for teenagers. Today, his voice was hollow, formal, and painfully distant. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if the horrifying rumors were true. He simply told me that the local morning news had run a sensational front-page story detailing my highly publicized arrest. The headline had painted me as a desperate, violent husband who sabotaged his wealthy wife's vehicle. David took a heavy, labored breath and delivered the final blow. He explained that the district school board had convened an emergency remote meeting at the crack of dawn. They were terrified of the public relations nightmare. A teacher facing charges of attempted murder and severe domestic sabotage was a massive liability. Effective immediately, I was placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave. I desperately tried to reason with him. I begged him to look at my spotless, decade-long record to remember the man he had worked with every single day. I told him I was completely innocent and the victim of a coordinated legal setup by a deeply corrupt family. David softly interrupted me, stating that his hands were completely tied by district policy. He advised me not to contact any students or faculty members. My health insurance was suspended. My steady income was instantly evaporated. The phone call ended with a sharp click, echoing the absolute destruction of my professional dignity. I was utterly stripped of everything that made me a human being. The Sterling family had successfully orchestrated a total erasure of my identity. I started the car engine, watching the fuel gauge desperately hover near empty, and drove aimlessly toward the industrial side of town. I counted exactly $14.30 in loose cash from my glove compartment. That was the entirety of my net worth. I walked into a brightly lit gas station, keeping my head down to avoid the security cameras, and bought a stale turkey sandwich and a bottle of tap water. I felt like a hunted fugitive in my own city. I drove until I found a vacant gravel parking lot that sat exactly 1 mile away from the towering central hospital. I parked the car facing the massive glass structure and ate the tasteless food in pure, suffocating silence. I counted the floors up to the intensive care unit. I stared at the 4th floor windows until my eyes burned with unshed tears. The psychological torture of being so close to Claire, yet completely barricaded by an impenetrable wall of armed security and court orders, was slowly driving me insane. I knew exactly what was happening inside that sterile room. Richard and Patricia were standing over her bed, playing the role of devastated parents for the medical staff. Trent was likely pacing the hallways, using his slick corporate charm to ensure no one questioned their authority over her medical care. They were feeding her lies she could not even hear, burying my name while I was exiled to the cold asphalt like a stray dog. For 8 grueling days, this gravel lot became my entire universe. I slept in the freezing car, washing my face in public park restrooms and rationing my meager cash on cheap canned soup. The nights were the hardest. The sheer isolation played terrifying tricks on my mind. I began to wonder if the legal system Trent worshipped was truly unbeatable. He was a master of systemic karma, wielding money and influence like a butcher's knife while I was completely defenseless. On the evening of the 8th day, the temperature dropped well below freezing. I sat shivering under a thin emergency blanket I kept in my trunk. My phone battery was critically low, resting at a mere 4%. I plugged it into the dashboard charger, turning the ignition key, just to get 10 minutes of warm air from the failing heater. Suddenly, the cracked screen of my phone lit up with a harsh, glaring red light. A high-priority push notification overrode my lock screen. It was an automated fraud alert from the elite commercial bank that managed Claire's luxury real estate agency. Because we were legally married, my phone was still registered as a secondary emergency contact on the primary corporate account, an administrative oversight Trent must have missed. I stared at the digital text, my frozen fingers hovering over the glowing glass. Someone had just attempted to initiate an immediate unverified wire transfer of $4 million from Claire's business capital into an offshore holding company. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my exhausted brain. This was never just about getting rid of a blue-collar husband. They were actively liquidating her empire while she lay trapped in a coma. I did not sleep a single second after that banking alert illuminated the dark interior of my freezing car. As soon as the morning sun crested over the concrete skyline, I drove straight to the county courthouse annex. I was desperate for any form of legal guidance, but my entirely empty bank account meant I was completely at the mercy of the underfunded public defender system. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and absolute despair. After 3 agonizing hours of sitting on a hard plastic chair, a court clerk finally called my name. I was ushered down a narrow hallway into a cramped, windowless office stacked floor to ceiling with overflowing cardboard boxes. My assigned attorney was a young, severely overworked woman named Sarah. She looked like she had not slept in a solid week, her small desk completely covered in half-eaten takeout wrappers and endless stacks of legal briefs. She did not offer me a comforting smile or words of reassurance. She simply pulled a thick, freshly printed stack of legal documents from her humming printer and pushed them heavily across the scratched wooden desk. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I had a massive problem that went far beyond my pending criminal charges. Sarah explained that while I was freezing in my car, Richard and Trent Sterling had successfully bypassed standard family court procedures. They had filed a massive, incredibly aggressive petition for emergency medical and financial conservatorship over Claire. I stared at her across the desk, completely confused by the legal terminology. I raised my voice slightly, insisting that I was Claire's legal husband, and that fact automatically made me her next of kin and primary medical proxy. Sarah simply pointed a weary finger at the top page of the thick petition. She explained that Trent had brilliantly weaponized my recent arrest to completely rewrite reality. By utilizing the police report and the temporary restraining order he had personally orchestrated, Trent successfully petitioned the court to strip me of all my marital rights. The official document labeled me as a violent criminal under active felony investigation, legally rendering me completely unfit to make any decisions for my incapacitated wife. I picked up the heavy stack of paper, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I read the dense, manipulative legal jargon. Trent had masterfully painted Richard as the loving, devastated father, bravely stepping in to save his daughter from a dangerous financial predator. But as I flipped to the 4th page of the filing, my eyes locked onto a highly specific financial clause that made my stomach turn over. The petition explicitly granted Richard total unchecked authority to immediately liquidate Claire's highly successful luxury real estate agency. The justification written in the document claimed the liquidation was absolutely necessary to cover the astronomical costs of Claire's specialized medical care. But I knew the cold, hard truth. I knew Claire possessed premium top-tier medical insurance that effortlessly covered every single dime of her hospital stay. They did not need to sell her company to pay for doctors or specialists. They needed absolute legal cover to drain her corporate accounts dry. The fraudulent $4 million wire transfer attempt I saw on my phone the night before was just their sloppy first attempt to move the money. Now they were using a naive judge to hand them the keys to her entire financial empire legally. But the bold theft of her business was not the most terrifying part of the document. As I reached the final section regarding advanced medical directives, a wave of pure paralyzing ice washed over my entire body. I read the paragraph 3 separate times, completely unable to process the sheer evil printed on the page. The conservatorship explicitly granted Richard the ultimate authority to dictate Claire's life support measures. Trent had buried a deeply specific, terrifying medical timeline within the dense legal text. It plainly stated that if Claire did not show significant neurological recovery by day 20 of her hospitalization, Richard had the legal right to terminate all artificial life support. They were going to pull the plug. I dropped the paperwork onto the desk, my breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. My public defender looked at me with genuine pity, softly advising me that judges almost always grant these emergency petitions to wealthy, upstanding parents when the husband is actively facing felony charges. She told me the upcoming hearing was mostly just a formality, but she did not understand the horrifying reality hiding right beneath the black legal ink. The scattered pieces of the puzzle aggressively locked together in my mind, forming a perfect picture of absolute, calculated malice. This nightmare was never about their snobby hatred for my blue-collar background. This was never about a wealthy father protecting his precious daughter from a poor, uneducated husband. It was entirely about self-preservation and extreme financial greed. Claire was an exceptionally brilliant businesswoman. She handled every single aspect of her agency with meticulous detail and total transparency. If Richard and Trent were secretly siphoning millions of dollars from her corporate accounts to cover their own reckless investments or mounting gambling debts, Claire would absolutely be the one to catch them red-handed. That is exactly why they were fighting so viciously to liquidate the agency now. They needed to shred the financial records and permanently bury their massive theft before the federal authorities ever caught wind of it. And much more importantly, it perfectly explained the violent crash. It explained the stolen wire cutters from my garage and the perfectly fabricated witness statements. It explained why they needed me legally locked out of the hospital and stripped of my rights as her husband. If Claire finally woke up, she would talk. She would tell the police exactly who was stealing from her. She would expose their entire corrupt empire to the world. They did not just want my wife's money. They desperately needed her silenced permanently. Day 20 was not a compassionate medical recommendation based on her chances of survival. Day 20 was their strict, self-imposed deadline to legally execute my wife before she could open her eyes and send her own father and brother to a federal penitentiary. I knew Trent's daily routine better than I ever wanted to admit. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, before heading up to his mahogany-paneled law firm, he stopped at an upscale artisanal coffee shop in the heart of the financial district. The risk of approaching him there was absolutely massive. If Trent felt threatened or even simply annoyed by my presence, he could make a single phone call to the police. Violating the strict parameters of the temporary restraining order would trigger an immediate arrest. My bail would be instantly revoked and I would be thrown straight into a county jail cell without a second thought. But the horrifying revelation of their financial hijacking left me with absolutely no other choice. I had to look my arrogant brother-in-law in the eye and let him know his flawless execution had a serious crack. I parked my battered car 2 blocks away and walked through the crisp morning air, blending in with the rush-hour crowd of tailored suits and briefcases. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the cafe. The interior smelled of roasted espresso beans and expensive cologne. Trent was sitting alone at a corner table, typing rapidly on his sleek laptop, a steaming cup of imported coffee resting perfectly beside his leather notepad. He looked completely unbothered, a man who had successfully secured his financial future while casually signing his own sister's death warrant. I walked straight up to his table, pulled out the plush velvet chair opposite him, and sat down hard. Trent did not flinch. He slowly lifted his eyes from his glowing screen, taking in my unwashed hair, my wrinkled jacket, and the dark, heavy circles under my exhausted eyes. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He smiled gently as if greeting an old friend, rather than the man he was currently trying to frame for attempted murder. He warned me that I was standing on incredibly thin ice, noting that the police precinct was only 3 blocks away. I ignored his passive-aggressive threat and leaned across the small marble table. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring the surrounding patrons could not hear the venom dripping from my words. I told him I saw the automated fraud alert on my cellular phone the night before. I watched his perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitch just a fraction of an inch. I laid everything out on the table. I told him I knew about the massive, unverified $4 million wire transfer he tried to push through Claire's corporate account. I told him I read the emergency conservatorship filing, and I completely understood why he needed Richard to have total medical proxy before day 20. They were not trying to save her business. They were desperately trying to cover up a massive, catastrophic embezzlement scheme before the federal authorities started auditing her agency. I waited for the sudden panic to set in. I waited for his face to drain of color. Instead of panicking, Trent actually laughed. It was a rich, genuine sound of pure amusement that chilled me to the absolute core of my bones. He calmly closed his laptop screen and folded his hands neatly on the tabletop. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity, the kind of condescending look a brilliant professor gives a struggling student who simply cannot grasp a basic concept. He leaned forward and whispered that knowing the truth and proving the truth were 2 entirely different universes. He reminded me that I was currently a homeless, disgraced public employee, actively facing severe felony charges. He, on the other hand, was a senior partner at the most prestigious legal firm in the state. He boasted that his family played golf with the judges, funded the local police pension programs, and dictated the exact headlines printed in the morning papers. He explained that the legal framework was never designed to uncover some grand objective truth. It was a highly expensive, heavily guarded machine built specifically to protect generational wealth and completely crush anyone standing in its way. He wanted me to completely internalize my utter powerlessness. Then he delivered a line that I will remember until the day I die. He looked directly into my eyes, his voice dripping with absolute certainty, and confidently stated, "You're a teacher, Tom. I'm the system. You lose." He was absolutely right about my lack of financial resources, but his colossal ego made him incredibly blind to his own mistakes. As he prepared to stand up and leave me sitting in my own defeat, his demeanor suddenly shifted. The calm, untouchable corporate lawyer cracked for just a brief, highly volatile second. He leaned back down over the marble table, his voice suddenly sharp, paranoid, and aggressive. He demanded to know if Claire had given me anything in the days before the accident. He aggressively interrogated me, asking if she had passed off any physical agency hard drives, encrypted memory sticks, or offline backup servers. He threatened that if I was currently hiding any of her proprietary data, he would ensure I faced federal corporate espionage charges on top of my impending murder trial. He stared at me with wide, manic intensity, searching my face for any sign of deception, before finally turning his back and walking briskly out the glass doors. I sat frozen in the velvet chair, my heart hammering a wild rhythm against my chest. Why would a man who supposedly controlled the entire legal system care about a random hard drive unless the primary evidence of his monumental fraud was not securely stored in her downtown office? The realization struck me like a physical blow to the head. Claire kept all her sensitive local backups inside a reinforced lockbox bolted beneath the passenger seat of her car. The evidence of their motive was not sitting in a filing cabinet. It was trapped inside her crushed, mangled vehicle. The yellow glow of the Civic dome light barely illuminated the thick stack of paper resting on my steering wheel. It was past 2 in the morning and the temperature outside had dropped well below freezing. I blew onto my hands, trying to generate enough warmth to turn the crisp pages of the police report my public defender had managed to secure for me. Most of the document was completely useless, heavily blacked out by thick strokes of government redaction ink to protect the ongoing investigation. The police had clearly built their entire narrative around the carefully planted wire cutters and the synchronized lies told by Richard and Trent. Every single paragraph painted me as a calculated monster. But I refused to sleep. I read every visible word, every legal code, and every timestamp over and over again until my eyes burned. I was desperately searching for a single crack in their flawless armor. I scanned the bureaucratic jargon of the vehicle recovery section. Claire had driven a highly customized luxury sport utility vehicle. It was currently sitting in the Central City impound lot, locked behind chain-link fences and razor wire as the primary piece of physical evidence in an active felony investigation. As I flipped to the administrative addendum at the very back of the folder, a repetitive string of legal filings caught my attention. It was a formal log of external communications regarding the wrecked vehicle. My brother-in-law had been incredibly busy. According to the timestamps, Trent had filed 5 separate emergency legal petitions over the last 10 days demanding the immediate release of Claire's crushed car. I sat up straight, the freezing air inside the cabin suddenly forgotten. I read the formal requests again, completely baffled by the sheer volume of his legal maneuvering. Trent was aggressively petitioning the local magistrate to bypass the standard investigative hold. His documented justification claimed the family needed to transfer the wreckage to a private third-party salvage yard for immediate scrapping. He cited urgent insurance purposes and a desire to avoid the accumulating daily municipal impound fees. I stared at his signature on the bottom of the printed forms, a cold knot forming deep in my stomach. Nothing about this made any logical sense. Trent was a wildly successful corporate attorney who routinely handled multi-million-dollar mergers. The idea that he was genuinely concerned about paying a $50 daily impound fee on behalf of his wealthy father was utterly laughable. But more importantly, the legal strategy was a massive, glaring contradiction. According to the police, that mangled vehicle was the absolute core of their entire case against me. It was the physical location of my supposed sabotage. It was the murder weapon I allegedly used to try and kill my wife. If Trent truly believed I was a violent criminal who had cut his sister's brake lines, he would want that car preserved in a climate-controlled vault. He would want a dozen forensic mechanics tearing it apart to secure an airtight conviction against me. Instead, the lead accuser was spending thousands of dollars in billable legal hours trying to crush the primary evidence into an unrecognizable metal cube. Why was a high-powered lawyer so completely desperate to destroy the very object that supposedly proved my guilt? I gripped the steering wheel, staring blindly out the frosted windshield as my mind raced backwards. I stripped away the emotional trauma of the hospital and focused entirely on Claire. I thought about her habits, her intelligence, and the immense pressure she had been under at the real estate agency during the final weeks before the crash. The memory surfaced with absolute terrifying clarity. It was late on a Tuesday night, exactly 1 month before the accident. I had woken up to get a glass of water and found Claire sitting alone at our kitchen table in the dark. Only the pale light from her laptop illuminated her face. She was surrounded by scattered banking statements and escrow ledgers. When I asked her what was wrong, she quickly closed the computer screen, rubbing her temples with trembling fingers. She looked at me with a level of deep, uncharacteristic fear. She confessed she had spent the last 3 weeks quietly auditing the company books after noticing massive financial discrepancies. She strongly suspected someone very close to her was actively skimming huge sums of capital from her commercial accounts. I remembered asking her why she did not just go directly to her father and her brother for help, since they both handled the financial trust and legal contracts for the agency. Claire had looked away. her voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. She told me she could no longer trust her own blood. She felt completely exposed, claiming she was being constantly watched and monitored. She knew the Sterling family relied on her agency as their primary cash cow, and she was terrified of what they might do if she officially confronted them without irrefutable proof. Then she told me something I had completely forgotten in the chaotic blur of my arrest. Claire was incredibly proactive when it came to her personal safety. She told me that morning she had driven her luxury vehicle to an independent electronics shop on the opposite side of the city. She explicitly avoided the family dealership and any mechanic associated with her father. She paid the technician in cash to completely strip the factory dashboard and install a military-grade dual-channel security system. It was a hidden hardwired camera setup that did not sync to the family cloud network. It operated entirely in secret, recording both the road ahead and the interior cabin, storing every single second of audio and video on a concealed physical memory card. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the sheer magnitude of her secret hit me. Trent did not care about the cut brake lines or my stolen wire cutters. Those were just cheap theatrical props designed specifically to keep the police fixated on my garage. Trent was absolutely terrified of the car itself. He knew Claire was building a case against him, and he knew that if the police forensic team dug deep enough into that crushed dashboard, they would eventually find her hidden camera. They would find the exact digital truth of what really happened on that mountain road. The evidence of their staggering financial theft and their brutal motive for murder was physically trapped inside that impound lot, and Trent was literally days away from sending it to the incinerator. The silence of the cold night pressed heavily against the windows of my car. I looked down at the police report in my lap, the black redacted lines no longer looking like an impenetrable wall. They looked like a ticking clock. I had finally found the fatal flaw in their perfect crime. Now I just had to get to it before they crushed my wife's final message into dust. The glaring dome light of my Honda cast a harsh yellow glow over the final page of the heavily redacted police report. My fingers traced the cold, black ink of a judicial signature at the bottom of the paper. It was an expedited property release authorization. Trent had finally pushed his relentless legal machinery through the bureaucratic red tape. The local magistrate had signed the order just hours ago. The heavily damaged vehicle was no longer considered active evidence by the corrupt local precinct. According to the typed instructions, the city impound facility was scheduled to release the crushed sport utility vehicle directly to a private salvage company at exactly 6:00 the following morning. I glanced at the glowing digital clock on my dashboard. It was currently 2:45 in the morning. I had exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes before my brother-in-law legally dragged the only piece of exonerating evidence into an industrial car crusher. I read the name of the private salvage company listed on the transfer document. It was a subsidiary holding firm I recognized from helping Claire organize her early real estate tax files. The scrapyard was indirectly owned by one of Richard Sterling's oldest golfing partners. They were keeping the destruction entirely within their corrupt circle of wealthy friends. Trent had arranged for the car to be transported flattened and melted down before the morning sun even had a chance to rise. The sheer speed of their operation left me absolutely breathless. They knew the window to silence Claire was closing rapidly. They were moving with ruthless, terrifying efficiency to bury their sins. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, the biting winter cold seeping through the thin floorboards of my car. I stared blankly at the steering wheel. The reality of my situation formed a suffocating knot in my throat. The police impound lot was not just a fenced dirt field. It was a highly secure municipal fortress surrounded by razor wire, monitored by high-definition security cameras, and actively patrolled by armed night watchmen. In order to retrieve the hidden memory card from Claire's dashboard, I would have to commit a severe, undeniable felony. I would have to physically break into a guarded government facility. The legal consequences of that action were completely paralyzing. I was currently out on a massive $12,000 bond. I was already the prime suspect in a horrific attempted murder investigation. If a security guard caught me trespassing inside the police impound yard, my bail would be instantly revoked. I would be thrown face first onto the frozen concrete, handcuffed and transported directly to a maximum security county jail cell. There would be absolutely no second chances. I would lose the ability to fight for my wife. Richard would be granted total freedom to execute his sinister medical conservatorship. He would pull the plug on Claire's ventilator on day 20 without a single person left to challenge him. But the alternative was equally fatal. If I stayed in my car and played by the rules of their rigged justice system, the sun would rise, the tow truck would arrive, and the DASHCAM would be incinerated. The video proving Trent deliberately rammed Claire off that mountain pass would be destroyed forever. The audio recording of Claire exposing their $4 million embezzlement scheme would turn to ash. The truth would die inside that scrapyard, and my wife would die in her hospital bed. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that inaction was a guaranteed death sentence for us both. The system was never going to save me. I had to step outside the law to save my family. A sudden surge of adrenaline flushed the exhaustion completely out of my system. I threw the police report onto the passenger seat and began to prepare. I needed to move with absolute precision and leave zero trace of my presence. I reached into my duffel bag in the back seat and pulled out the darkest clothing I owned. I swapped my light blue flannel shirt for a heavy black hooded sweatshirt. I pulled on dark work pants and laced up my scuffed leather boots. My hands were remarkably steady. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me for the last 18 days was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve that I had never felt before. I reached for my cellular phone sitting on the center console. I stared at the dark screen for a long moment. Trent and Richard possessed immense wealth and deep connections within the local law enforcement agencies. I knew modern cellular devices constantly pinged global positioning satellites and local cell towers. If a major crime occurred at the impound lot tonight, the police could easily subpoena my location data. They could place me exactly at the scene of the break-in. I could not risk a single digital breadcrumb leading back to my car. I held the power button down, watching the screen power off completely. I shoved the device deep underneath the driver's seat, pushing it completely out of sight. I was entirely off the grid. No one could track my movements, but I had no way to call for help if everything went horribly wrong. I put my car into drive and pulled out of the vacant gravel lot. I kept my headlights turned off until I reached the main road, slipping quietly into the deserted city streets. The drive toward the municipal industrial district was eerily silent. The towering concrete warehouses and abandoned factories cast long, menacing shadows across the cracked pavement. Every streetlight I passed felt like an interrogation spotlight trying to expose my desperation. I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the dark road ahead. I had lost my dignity, my career, my home, and my savings. The only thing I had left to lose was my life, and I was entirely willing to risk it. I turned the final corner into the desolate warehouse sector, steering my car into the absolute darkness of the night, fully prepared to break into the belly of the beast. The rusted metal sign of the municipal impound lot loomed out of the freezing fog like a massive gravestone. It was completely surrounded by a towering 12-foot chain-link fence topped with tightly coiled razor wire. I crouched behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets across the desolate street, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The facility was heavily fortified. High-intensity floodlights swept across the massive graveyard of twisted metal, rotating in slow and highly predictable arcs. I watched a uniformed private security guard walk past the main gate, casually holding a steaming thermos of coffee, while a heavy black flashlight swung at his hip. I had absolutely no illusions about what would happen if that blinding light caught my face. My bail would be instantly revoked, and Richard Sterling would completely win his sadistic game. My wife would die in a medically induced slumber, completely surrounded by the very people who put her there. I pulled my dark hood tightly over my head and waited for the sweeping beam of the tower light to glide past the western perimeter. The exact second the yard plunged back into deep shadow, I sprinted across the cracked asphalt. My heavy work boots hit the concrete base of the chain-link fence. I did not pause to think or let the paralyzing fear take over my body. I shoved my bare fingers into the freezing metal grid and pulled my entire body upward. The sheer physical exertion burned through my deeply exhausted muscles. I reached the top just as the sweeping floodlight began its slow return arc toward my specific position. I threw my heavy canvas jacket over the razor wire to protect my skin and vaulted my body over the dangerous metal teeth. I hit the frozen dirt on the other side with a sharp and breathless thud, rolling immediately under the rusted chassis of an abandoned pickup truck. Right above me, the blinding white light washed over the fence line, missing my boots by mere inches. I pressed my cold cheek against the freezing gravel, forcing my erratic breathing to slow down. I was officially a trespassing felon inside a secured government facility. The impound lot was an absolute labyrinth of tragedy. I crawled slowly through narrow and incredibly jagged aisles of mangled cars, completely surrounded by the suffocating smell of leaked motor oil, rusted iron, and stale antifreeze. Every single shadow looked exactly like an approaching guard. Every distant crunch of gravel made my adrenaline spike to highly dangerous levels. Trent Sterling had specifically requested Claire's vehicle be completely segregated for immediate private transport, which meant it would definitely not be stored with the general traffic collisions. I moved deeper into the restricted rear section of the massive facility, slipping quietly past rows of impounded commercial trucks and seized luxury sedans. At the very back of the dark lot, backed tightly against a towering concrete retaining wall, I finally saw it. A single vehicle covered entirely by a heavy and industrial gray tarp. It sat completely isolated from the rest of the mechanical graveyard, waiting like a designated target for the morning salvage crew. I crept toward the dark tarp, glancing frantically over my shoulder to ensure the security patrol was still lingering near the front gate. I grabbed the frozen corner of the heavy canvas cover and pulled it sharply backward. The thick material fell away, revealing the crumpled silver frame of Claire's luxury sport utility vehicle. The air was violently sucked right out of my lungs. Reading about a catastrophic car crash in a redacted police report was one thing. Seeing the brutal and highly physical aftermath with my own two eyes was a completely different universe of psychological trauma. The entire front end of the luxury car was smashed into a terrifying and unrecognizable accordion of crushed steel and splintered fiberglass. The driver's side door was completely sheared off its thick metal hinges. The deployed airbags hung limply from the steering wheel like deflated ghosts. I staggered backward, my knees buckling slightly under the sheer emotional weight of the visual horror. My mind instantly placed Claire inside that crushing metal trap, imagining her final moments of sheer terror as her vehicle was violently shoved off the edge of a steep mountain pass. A sudden wave of intense nausea washed over me, accompanied by a blinding flash of pure and unadulterated grief. I desperately wanted to collapse onto the freezing dirt and scream until my vocal cords bled, but I forced my eyes tightly shut, digging my fingernails painfully deep into my palms. I could not break down. If I gave in to the agonizing trauma right now, the monsters who did this to my wife would walk away completely untouched. I swallowed the rising bile, opened my eyes, and stepped forward into the sharp wreckage. Getting inside the ruined cabin was incredibly dangerous. The structural frame was violently compressed, leaving barely enough room for a human body to maneuver. I carefully stepped over the jagged metal edge of the missing driver's side door, lowering my tall frame into the ruined driver's seat. The dark interior smelled sharply of burnt explosive powder from the airbags and dried copper. Sharp shards of shattered safety glass coated every single surface like a thick layer of deadly winter frost. I ignored the physical danger and reached toward the center console. I was completely consumed by a singular and burning mission. I had to find the digital truth. The interior was remarkably dark, forcing me to rely entirely on my sense of touch. I moved my hands blindly across the ruined dashboard, feeling desperately for the custom wiring harness Claire had briefly mentioned. A massive piece of fractured windshield glass sliced a deep and agonizing gash directly across the palm of my right hand. I hissed in sharp pain, pulling my hand back as warm blood began to drip rapidly onto the ruined leather upholstery. I quickly wrapped a torn piece of my inner flannel shirt tightly around the bleeding wound, pulling the makeshift tourniquet securely with my teeth. I could not afford to waste a single second worrying about an injury. The digital clock in my mind was ticking down to 0. The salvage tow truck was scheduled to arrive at exactly 6:00 to crush this vehicle into an anonymous metal cube, erasing the Sterling family's horrific sins for all of eternity. I gritted my teeth against the searing pain radiating from my palm and reached upward toward the crushed roof of the cabin. My trembling and blood-soaked fingers finally located the rearview mirror. The heavy plastic housing was severely cracked from the violent physical impact of the crash, hanging precariously by a few exposed copper wires. I gripped the sides of the broken plastic shell, took a deep and highly steadying breath, and dug my thumbs directly into the damaged seam. The jagged plastic of the rearview mirror housing resisted my initial attempt to pry it apart. My right hand was throbbing with a steady pulse of hot pain radiating from the deep laceration across my palm, but I could not stop. I gripped the fractured edges with both hands, ignoring the warm blood making my fingers dangerously slippery. I squeezed my eyes shut and applied every ounce of physical strength I possessed. A sharp snap echoed in the freezing air as the heavy plastic shell finally broke into 2 separate pieces. The internal components of the mirror spilled out, dangling by thin colored wires. I wedged my index finger into the exposed circuitry, desperately feeling around the cold metal backing. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs. I worried that Trent had already sent someone to wipe the car clean. I feared the violent impact had completely destroyed the memory module. Then my fingernails scraped against a tiny and distinct rectangular edge. It was tucked perfectly inside a concealed recessed slot. I pinched the minuscule object and pulled it free. I opened my palm in the pitch-black cabin. Resting in the center of my bloody hand was a secure digital memory card no larger than my thumbnail. It was utterly weightless, yet it held the absolute power to dismantle an entire real estate empire and send my arrogant brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. This tiny piece of silicon was the only voice my wife had left in the world. It was her secret insurance policy, her digital witness to the horrifying betrayal orchestrated by her own family. A fierce wave of protective adrenaline washed over me. I carefully slipped the memory card into the deepest pocket of my dark work pants and zipped it securely shut. I had exactly what I came for. Now I just needed to survive the night. Just as I shifted my weight to climb out of the shattered door frame, a blinding beam of white light violently pierced the darkness. The intense beam struck the silver hood of Claire's crushed vehicle, casting terrifying and elongated shadows across the cabin. Heavy boots crunched rhythmically against the frozen gravel. The night watchman had deviated from his standard patrol route. He was walking directly toward the isolated wreckage at the back of the lot. Panic seized my throat. I threw myself downward, collapsing into the cramped and distorted driver's side footwell. My knees slammed brutally hard into the bent steering column, but I did not dare make a single sound. I curled my tall frame into a tight ball on the floorboard, completely surrounded by jagged debris and the metallic scent of deployed airbags. The crunching footsteps grew louder, stopping mere inches from the missing door. The harsh beam of the flashlight swept directly into the vehicle, illuminating the glass-covered passenger seat and the torn leather upholstery. I pressed my face firmly against the floor mat and squeezed my eyes completely shut. I held my breath until my lungs burned with absolute agony. My bleeding hand throbbed mercilessly, the warm liquid soaking into the fabric of my makeshift tourniquet. If the guard simply leaned his head inside the cabin and looked down, the game would be entirely over. He would draw his weapon, call the local police dispatch, and my $12,000 bail would be instantly revoked. I would be locked in a concrete cell before sunrise, and Richard Sterling would be completely free to terminate Claire's life support without a single legal challenge. My entire existence balanced on the edge of a razor. The beam of light paused, resting squarely on the broken steering wheel directly above my head. I heard the sudden static crackle of a radio on the guard's shoulder. A distorted voice barked a brief command about an arriving transport vehicle. The guard grunted a short response, tapped his heavy flashlight twice against the mangled roof of the car, and finally turned away. The crunch of his boots on the gravel slowly faded back toward the center of the impound facility. I remained frozen on the floorboard for another full minute, my chest heaving as I desperately gasped for the freezing air. My entire body shook with the receding adrenaline. I had narrowly escaped the absolute worst-case scenario, but my window of opportunity was slamming shut faster than I ever anticipated. I crawled out of the footwell and carefully extracted myself from the sharp and twisted metal of the wreckage. I pulled my dark hood low over my face and sprinted silently through the narrow and chaotic aisles of crushed cars. I navigated the mechanical graveyard with frantic urgency, keeping my eyes fixed on the towering perimeter fence in the distance. The brutal cold whipped against my face, but I could not feel the temperature anymore. I was fueled entirely by the singular mission to expose the monsters who had tried to murder my wife. As I neared the front boundary of the facility, a loud and heavy mechanical roar violently shattered the quiet night. I dropped to a low crouch behind a rusted commercial van and peered through the chain-link fence. Piercing halogen headlights illuminated the main entrance of the lot. A massive and heavy-duty flatbed tow truck idled aggressively at the security gate. Bold yellow lettering on the side of the truck clearly identified it as the private salvage company owned by the close associate of Richard Sterling. I glanced at the sky. It was entirely pitch black. Trent had not waited for the official morning release time. He had sent his cleanup crew hours early to completely secure the destruction of the evidence. I watched the night watchman jog over to unlock the heavy iron gates. There was absolutely no time to hesitate. I scrambled up the fence, completely ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my sliced palm. I threw my legs over the razor wire at the very top, tearing the fabric of my dark pants, and dropped heavily onto the frozen dirt outside the compound. I hit the ground running. I sprinted wildly into the desolate industrial darkness, leaving the tow truck behind, clutching the tiny memory card that was about to bring the entire Sterling empire crashing down to the ground. The sun had not yet crested the horizon when I pulled into the empty parking lot of the county library. It was the morning of the 18th day, 18 entire days of being hunted, humiliated, and exiled from the woman I loved. The freezing winter air bit through my torn jacket as I killed the engine and sat in the profound silence of my battered car. My right palm throbbed with a dull, heavy ache where the broken windshield glass had sliced my skin just hours earlier. I had wrapped it tightly in a fresh bandage from a gas station first aid kit, but the physical pain was completely overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of what rested in my pocket. I reached down and felt the outline of the tiny plastic square through the denim fabric. It was a digital lifeline. Because the police had confiscated my laptop along with my house keys, this public building was my only remaining portal to the truth. I stood outside the heavy glass doors for nearly 40 minutes, shifting my weight against the biting wind, waiting for the facility to open. A few elderly citizens and early morning readers gathered around me, none of them realizing they were standing next to a man actively out on bail for a fabricated felony. The exact second the head librarian unlocked the main entrance, I bypassed the front desk and walked with urgent, singular purpose toward the public computer lab in the far back corner. I chose an isolated terminal facing the brick wall to ensure absolute privacy. My hands shook violently as I pulled the micro memory card from my pocket. I practically held my breath as I slid the delicate piece of silicone into the desktop card reader. The computer monitor flickered brightly, casting a pale, clinical glow across my exhausted face. A digital folder popped up on the screen, displaying a long, highly organized list of video and audio files. Claire had spared absolutely no expense on this security system. Every single file was meticulously tagged with a precise date and time stamp. I gripped the plastic mouse, my index finger hovering over the cursor, and scrolled straight to the very bottom of the directory. I found the exact date of the horrific crash. The final file was time-stamped just moments before the local authorities claimed her vehicle plummeted off the steep mountain pass. I double-clicked the icon, my heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribcage. The high-definition video player launched instantly. Suddenly, the screen filled with the interior cabin view of Claire's luxury sport utility vehicle. Seeing her face brought a sudden violent wave of emotion crashing down upon me. It was not the pale, bruised, and broken woman lying motionless under harsh hospital lights. This was my brilliant, fiercely driven wife. She was wearing her favorite beige cashmere coat, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel with intense white-knuckled force. The towering pine trees and sheer rock faces of the mountain pass blurred rapidly outside the windows. But Claire did not look like a woman simply returning from a routine property appraisal. Her jaw was tightly clenched. Her eyes were burning with a profound, unadulterated fury that I had never personally witnessed in our 7 years of marriage. A sharp electronic chime echoed loudly through the computer speakers. The dashboard Bluetooth system had just connected a two-way conference call. The crisp, clear audio feed instantly filled my ears completely, capturing the voices of the two men who had spent the last 2 weeks actively trying to destroy my life. Trent spoke first. His tone was characteristically slick and arrogant, but underneath the polished corporate veneer I could hear a distinct, undeniable layer of raw panic. He asked his sister to pull the car over immediately so they could discuss the situation like rational adults. Richard quickly chimed in, adopting his deeply familiar, patronizing fatherly tone. He told Claire she was overreacting to a temporary cash flow problem and that going public would severely damage the elite reputation of the Sterling family brand. Claire did not hesitate. Her voice cut through their pathetic manipulations like a serrated blade. She told her father and her brother that she had spent the entire morning running a complete shadow audit on her own business accounts. She looked directly at the hidden dashboard camera, her eyes blazing with absolute conviction, and explicitly laid out their staggering crimes. She revealed that she had found the hidden ledgers, the offshore shell companies, and the deeply falsified escrow transfers. She practically screamed the final number into the vehicle microphone. $4 million. Trent had not simply made a few bad investments. He had completely drowned himself in massive illegal offshore gambling debts, and Richard had silently authorized the systematic draining of Claire's corporate capital to save his golden boy from facing federal ruin. Richard's voice cracked over the speakers, his manufactured authority completely evaporating. He desperately begged his daughter to turn the car around and come back to the downtown firm. He promised he would mortgage his own estate to repay every single stolen dollar. Trent immediately pivoted from begging to viciously threatening. He snarled through the phone line, warning Claire that if she exposed their financial embezzlement, she would completely destroy the entire family legacy. He told her she was acting like a dramatic, ungrateful child who did not understand how real business operated. He demanded she keep her mouth permanently shut. Claire gripped the steering wheel even tighter, her knuckles turning bone white. She told them she no longer considered either of them to be her family. She stated with absolute terrifying clarity that they were fundamentally broken, greedy men who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable bank account. She took a deep, steadying breath and delivered her final, uncompromising ultimatum. She told her father and brother that she was driving straight down the mountain pass and heading directly to the state police precinct to file a comprehensive fraud report. And after she handed over the audit files, she was going straight home to me. She told them her husband was the only decent, honest man she knew, and that she was finally going to expose the Sterling family for exactly what they were. I needed to see exactly how the horrific confrontation ended. My trembling fingers manipulated the computer mouse, clicking frantically to exit the forward-facing video feed and open the secondary directory. Claire had specifically paid for a dual-channel system, meaning there was a completely separate video file recording the exact same moments from the rear windshield. The video player loaded for an agonizingly slow second before the screen filled with the winding, treacherous curves of the mountain road stretching out behind her vehicle. The morning sky was gray and overcast, the steep asphalt slick with early morning mountain mist. For a few seconds, the footage showed nothing but empty road and towering pine trees receding into the background. Then a massive and deeply familiar shape violently pierced the fog. It was a heavy military-grade black sport utility vehicle. It was moving at a terrifying reckless speed, weaving across the double yellow lines to catch up to Claire. I leaned closer to the monitor, my face just inches from the glowing glass. The distinctive custom grille and the heavily tinted windows were completely unmistakable. It was Trent. He was driving his signature luxury vehicle, the exact same one he had casually leaned against outside the hospital lobby. My chest tightened so fiercely I forgot how to breathe. I was forced to watch a digital ghost of my wife being actively hunted down a dangerous mountain pass. The black vehicle did not simply follow her to continue their argument. It surged forward with aggressive predatory intent, completely ignoring the sharp curves and steep drop-offs lining the narrow highway. The video clearly captured the massive black grille filling the entire frame of the rear camera, tailgating Claire so closely that a single tap of her brakes would have caused a catastrophic pileup. I could see the sheer desperation in the erratic swerving movements of Claire's car as she desperately tried to gain some safe distance from her deranged brother. She was legally trapped on a winding mountain road, with absolutely nowhere to pull over and no cellular signal to call the police. Trent was utilizing his massive 3-ton luxury tank as a deadly weapon, actively terrorizing his own sister to prevent her from exposing his financial ruin. The cold, sickening reality of his psychopathic nature washed over me. He was not just a greedy corporate lawyer trying to cover his tracks. He was a ruthless monster fully prepared to execute his own family to protect his fraudulent empire. The horrific climax unfolded in a matter of seconds. The audio feed from the interior cabin file continued to play in perfect synchronization with the rear camera footage. The phone call had devolved into absolute chaos. Richard was screaming incoherently in the background, but his voice was entirely drowned out by the roaring engine of the black vehicle directly behind Claire. The video showed a brief, terrifying straightaway approaching the edge of a massive ravine. Trent did not hit his brakes. He did not attempt to swerve or simply intimidate her. The camera captured the black vehicle accelerating violently. The audio feed picked up the terrifying, deafening roar of his engine pushing to its absolute limit, completely followed by a distinct and horrifying command. Trent screamed through the active phone line, his voice echoing with pure, unfiltered malice, yelling to run her off. The very next frame captured the massive black hood of his vehicle slamming brutally into the rear bumper of Claire's car. The sickening metallic crunch of the impact blasted through my headphones. The camera violently shook, capturing the horrifying moment Claire's tires completely lost traction on the slick asphalt. The rear view spun wildly out of control, recording a terrifying blur of gray sky and jagged rocks before the screen violently smashed into darkness. I ripped the headphones off my ears, completely unable to listen to the agonizing sounds of tearing metal that followed the visual blackout. I sat frozen in the hard wooden chair of the public library, my entire body shaking with a toxic mixture of profound trauma and volcanic rage. I held the absolute undeniable truth right in the palm of my bleeding hand. I possessed high-definition visual evidence of a premeditated murder attempt directly paired with a crystal-clear audio confession detailing a staggering $4 million corporate embezzlement scheme. The sheer magnitude of the proof was completely staggering. My first overwhelming instinct was to sprint out of the double-glass doors, drive straight to the local police precinct, and violently slam the tiny memory card down onto the front desk. I wanted to see Detective Miller and Detective Davis watch the footage. I wanted to watch them swallow their arrogant pride and immediately dispatch a tactical strike team to arrest Trent in his tailored suit. But a sudden paralyzing realization stopped me completely dead in my tracks. I stared at the dark computer screen, my mind racing through the horrific events of the past 18 days. The local precinct had actively participated in my immediate character assassination. They had unquestioningly accepted Richard and Trent as credible witnesses without demanding a single shred of corroborating evidence. They had allowed the primary physical evidence to be expedited to a private scrapyard owned by Richard's golfing buddy. The entire local justice system was deeply infected by the Sterling family wealth. If I walked into that station and handed over the only existing copy of this dashcam footage, it would never reach a legitimate courtroom. Detective Miller would simply lock the memory card in a dark evidence room, and it would conveniently disappear before the sun set. I would be arrested on the spot for breaking my bail conditions, and Claire would be quietly unplugged by the end of the week. I realized I could not rely on the local authorities to save my wife. I needed a weapon that Trent's money could never reach, and I had exactly 24 hours left to find one. I sat in the quiet corner of the public library, staring blankly at the frozen frame of the video player. My mind raced through the terrifying reality of my situation. The local police department was completely compromised. If I simply walked into the downtown precinct and handed over the memory card, Detective Miller would confiscate it without a second thought. He would lock me in a holding cell for violating my bail conditions and ensure the video mysteriously vanished before the next shift change. I desperately needed an authority figure completely outside the toxic, highly funded reach of the Sterling family. I closed my eyes and filtered through a decade of memories, completely ignoring the throbbing pain in my bleeding hand. Finally, a single name surfaced from my past: Greg Harrison. Greg and I had shared a cramped dormitory room during our freshman year of college. While I eventually went into teaching American history, Greg went to law school and ruthlessly clawed his way up the legal ladder. He was now a senior fraud investigator for the state attorney general. His office was located 2 counties away, operating entirely on a federal and state level. He was completely immune to the country club politics of my local town. I carefully logged out of the public computer terminal, wiped my fingerprints from the plastic keyboard, and walked straight to a coin-operated payphone in the library lobby. I fed a handful of silver quarters into the metal slot and dialed the state office directory from memory. When Greg finally answered his private extension, I did not waste time with pleasantries or catching up. I spoke with a hollow, desperate urgency. I told him my wife was currently in a coma. Her family was actively trying to murder her to cover up a massive corporate embezzlement scheme, and I possessed the digital proof in my pocket. Greg did not doubt me for a single second. He told me to stay exactly where I was and keep my head down. 2 agonizing hours later, an unmarked gray sedan pulled into the dark back corner of the library parking lot. Greg looked older than I remembered. His face was deeply lined with the heavy stress of his profession, but his eyes held the exact same sharp intensity I recognized from our college days. He quickly ushered me into the passenger seat of his vehicle and immediately locked the heavy doors. I pulled the tiny memory card from my pocket and handed it over. He plugged the small piece of plastic into a rugged, heavily encrypted laptop securely mounted to his center console. For the next 20 minutes, Greg watched the footage in absolute suffocating silence. He listened intently as Claire screamed the exact dollar amount of the stolen funds over the phone. He watched the massive black vehicle intentionally ram my wife off a winding mountain road. When the video finally cut to a black screen, Greg simply picked up his secure radio and began issuing rapid, heavily coded commands to his forensic financial team back at the state capitol. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. Within 45 minutes, the state analysts had completely authenticated the raw metadata on the video files, conclusively proving the footage had not been altered or doctored in any capacity. But the subsequent information they uncovered made my blood run entirely cold. By tracing the specific offshore shell accounts Claire mentioned in the audio recording, the state investigators discovered a massive, frantic movement of corporate capital. Trent and Richard were not just stealing money from the real estate agency. They were actively liquidating every single vulnerable asset they could access and funneling the cash directly into untouchable foreign trusts. Greg looked up from his glowing screen, his expression grim and completely focused. He revealed that his financial team had just intercepted airline booking records. The Sterling men had purchased one-way first-class flight tickets to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty to the United States. Their flight was scheduled to depart in exactly 48 hours. They were meticulously preparing to cut their losses and run. They planned to leave Claire to die in a hospital bed while leaving me to rot in a maximum security county prison. Greg calmly explained that while we now possessed more than enough raw evidence to initiate a massive state-level prosecution, the bureaucratic process of drafting major felony warrants would realistically take at least a full day to process. Panic seized my throat like a physical grip. I grabbed Greg by the shoulder, my voice rising in sheer desperation. I told him we absolutely did not have a full day to wait for paperwork. The emergency conservatorship hearing was officially scheduled for 9 o'clock the very next morning. If the corrupt local judge signed that specific legal document, Richard would immediately gain total medical proxy over his daughter. With those court documents in his manicured hand, Richard could legally walk straight into the intensive care unit and order the hospital staff to turn off Claire's mechanical ventilator. He could completely silence the only living witness to his monumental crimes before the state police ever had the chance to surround his mansion. Greg stared blankly at the dark dashboard, completely absorbing the horrifying and rapidly shrinking timeline. He slowly closed his encrypted laptop and turned to fully face me in the dim light of the vehicle. He stated flatly that we could not wait for the standard arrest warrants to clear the state pipeline. We had to cut the snake off at the head before it could strike. Greg laid out a brilliant, incredibly dangerous strategy. He told me we were going to let Trent and Richard walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning feeling completely invincible. We were going to let them stand proudly in front of their wealthy friends and present their flawless web of lies to the presiding judge. And right before the final gavel fell, we would spring the trap in open court. The interior of my aging sedan felt smaller than ever as midnight slowly crept toward a gray, unforgiving dawn. I sat entirely motionless in the cramped driver's seat, watching the thick winter frost aggressively claim the edges of my cracked windshield. The car engine was silent to conserve what little fuel remained in my nearly empty tank. I did not care about the freezing temperatures seeping into my exhausted bones. My physical discomfort was completely irrelevant now. I held my phone in my bandaged right hand, the screen glowing brightly with a digital photograph of my wife. It was a picture I had taken during our anniversary trip last autumn. Claire was smiling radiantly against a vibrant backdrop of golden foliage, her eyes filled with an undeniable warmth and a fiercely loyal spirit. Staring at her beautiful face, the heavy suffocating blanket of despair that had crushed my chest for 18 consecutive days began to rapidly dissolve. It was instantly replaced by something entirely different. The raw, desperate panic was permanently gone. The agonizing grief of losing my suburban home, my teaching career, and my personal dignity burned away like dry kindling, leaving behind a cold, deeply calculated resolve. Richard and Trent had spent weeks treating me like a pathetic, easily disposable pawn on their luxurious chessboard. They had severely underestimated the terrifying lengths a quiet man will go to protect the woman he loves. I ran my thumb gently over the glass screen, making a silent, unbreakable promise to the frozen image of my wife. Tomorrow morning, the ruthless men who tried to bury her would face absolute, undeniable destruction. I leaned my head back against the worn fabric of the headrest and closed my eyes not to seek sleep, but to mentally prepare for the brutal judicial warfare that awaited me at sunrise. The morning light cast long, imposing shadows across the wide concrete steps of the county courthouse. It was a massive, heavily pillared building designed specifically to project absolute power and unyielding authority. I walked through the heavy metal detectors at the security checkpoint with a hollow, echoing calmness. I had not showered in several days. My dark work pants were visibly torn at the knee from scaling the municipal impound lot fence the night before, and my flannel shirt was heavily wrinkled and stained. I knew perfectly well that I looked exactly like the desperate, unhinged vagrant the Sterling family had legally declared me to be. That was precisely the point of my strategy. Let them confidently believe their own fabricated narrative until the very last possible second. I navigated the bustling marble corridors and approached the third-floor civil division. The hallway outside the designated courtroom looked more like an exclusive country club mixer than a solemn judicial proceeding. Richard had clearly mobilized his entire social network to witness his final victory. The corridor was absolutely packed with wealthy commercial developers, local municipal politicians, and sharply dressed real estate partners. They spoke in hushed, somber tones, performing a sickening display of upper-class solidarity for a medical tragedy they secretly viewed as a mere financial inconvenience. Standing right at the epicenter of this elite gathering was my arrogant brother-in-law. Trent looked like an absolute king presiding over his blindly loyal court. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than $5,000. His hair was perfectly styled, and a subtle, highly confident smile played on his lips as he shook hands and graciously accepted sympathetic pats on the back from his affluent peers. He radiated an aura of pure, untouchable invincibility. From his incredibly distorted perspective, he had already won the war. He had successfully liquidated millions in stolen corporate assets, purchased a highly secretive one-way ticket to a tropical tax haven, and was just minutes away from securing the permanent legal authority to quietly murder his own sister. He truly believed he had completely beaten the system. He had meticulously planned every single phase of his monumental crime, leaving absolutely nothing to chance. He viewed the judicial process not as a search for truth, but as a simple administrative hurdle he could easily clear with his massive checkbook and his slick corporate charm. He firmly believed he was the smartest, most ruthless predator walking the halls of that courthouse. I waited patiently in the heavy shadows near the elevator bank until the thick oak doors of the courtroom swung wide open and the chattering crowd began filtering inside. I gave them 3 minutes to find their seats and settle comfortably into their polished wooden pews. Then I stepped out into the open hallway and walked directly toward the entrance. My heavy boots struck the polished marble floor with hard, rhythmic thuds. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped over the threshold into the sprawling judicial chamber. The air in the massive room instantly shifted. Conversations abruptly halted as dozens of heads turned rapidly to stare at my disheveled, unwelcome appearance. Sitting proudly at the primary plaintiff table, Trent slowly turned his head to see what had caused the sudden silence. The exact moment his eyes locked onto mine, his confident expression hardened into a mask of vicious, unadulterated annoyance. He did not see a legitimate threat standing at the back of the room. He merely saw a stubborn, defeated pest who stubbornly refused to accept his inevitable ruin. Trent leaned casually back in his expensive leather chair, his lips curling into a deeply familiar, sickening smirk. Without breaking eye contact, he raised a single manicured finger and beckoned to the massive uniformed bailiff standing near the jury box. Trent leaned close to the armed officer and whispered an urgent command to physically arrest me on the spot for blatantly violating the active restraining order. The heavy leather utility belt of the bailiff creaked loudly in the quiet room as he rested his hand on his standard-issue handcuffs, fully prepared to drag me away. The heavy hand of the armed bailiff clamped down on my shoulder just as the presiding judge walked through the private chambers. Before the officer could lock the cold metal handcuffs around my bruised wrists, my public defender stepped directly into his path. Sarah fiercely cited my fundamental legal right to be present as an active spouse, slamming a freshly printed motion directly onto the wooden desk. The sudden commotion immediately caught the attention of Judge Harrison. He was an older, incredibly stern-looking man who had served on the county bench for over 3 decades. His deep personal ties to the local country club elite were instantly apparent to anyone paying attention. He gave Richard Sterling a highly sympathetic, familiar nod before banging his heavy wooden gavel. He gruffly ordered the bailiff to release me but strictly confined me to the very back row of the public gallery. I was officially warned that a single out-of-turn syllable would result in an immediate contempt charge and a swift, permanent trip to a holding cell. I rubbed my aching collarbone and stood silently against the dark oak paneling, completely surrounded by hostile stares. The formal hearing commenced and Trent instantly took center stage. I had spent 10 long years watching high school students perform in amateur theater productions, but absolutely nothing compared to the sickeningly brilliant acting masterclass my brother-in-law delivered that morning. He stood before the high wooden bench, his pristine $5,000 suit perfectly tailored, and actually managed to force genuine shimmering tears to well up in his eyes. His voice trembled with an expertly manufactured grief as he spoke about his beloved younger sister. He painted a tragic, horrifying picture of Claire trapped in a sterile, vegetative nightmare, completely robbed of her vibrant, ambitious spirit. He gestured dramatically toward Richard, who sat slumped at the plaintiff table with his face buried in his trembling hands, playing the part of a broken, helpless father to absolute perfection. Trent then slowly turned his gaze toward the back of the room, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. The profound sorrow in his voice instantly morphed into righteous, burning anger. He told the judge that the violent, unhinged monster entirely responsible for crushing Claire's beautiful life was standing right there in the courtroom. He regurgitated the fabricated police reports, word for word, heavily emphasizing the stolen wire cutters and the completely fake history of my explosive temper. He pleaded with the court to protect his vulnerable family from my ongoing terror. He labeled me a desperate financial parasite who was entirely willing to murder a successful woman rather than face the humiliation of an impending divorce. Then came the ultimate devastating request. Trent smoothly transitioned his legal argument into a sickening plea for medical mercy. He softly argued that keeping Claire artificially hooked to a mechanical ventilator was a cruel, selfish act of prolonged physical torture. He stated that her luxury real estate agency needed to be immediately and quietly liquidated to settle her rapidly mounting medical debts. He insisted that Richard needed full medical proxy to finally let his daughter go peacefully into the next life. It was a flawless, legally bulletproof argument wrapped entirely in the deceptive language of love and compassion. The entire gallery of wealthy spectators murmured in quiet collective agreement. Women dressed in expensive designer outfits wiped their eyes with delicate tissues. Men in sharp business attire shook their heads in somber, supportive solidarity. I stood completely frozen against the back wall, forced to watch the faces of the local elite completely swallow the poisonous narrative. They were actively cheering for my absolute destruction and my wife's legally sanctioned execution. The sheer terrifying power of the Sterling family wealth was fully on display, bending the entire judicial reality to their sinister will. Judge Harrison let out a heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh. He slowly removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking down at the massive stack of legal documents Trent had meticulously prepared. The judge openly declared that this was one of the most tragic, profoundly clear-cut cases of domestic sabotage he had ever witnessed from the bench. He offered Richard his deepest personal condolences, assuring the older man that the court would grant him the total legal authority he needed to handle his daughter's final arrangements. My heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribcage. The judge reached out and picked up a thick, highly polished gold fountain pen. He removed the cap and hovered the shiny metal tip directly over the primary signature line of the emergency conservatorship order. If that golden pen touched the crisp white paper, Richard would instantly possess the unchallengeable legal right to pull Claire's life support. The digital evidence hidden in my pocket would become entirely useless to a dead woman. I could not wait for Sarah to formally object. I could not wait for the state investigator to subtly signal me from the back row. The lives of my entire family rested on a single imminent drop of black ink. I pushed myself violently away from the oak wall and stepped firmly into the center aisle. My voice cracked like thunder across the silent, tense courtroom, loudly demanding that the judge put the pen down immediately. The entire room gasped in loud collective shock. Trent spun around on his expensive leather shoes, his fake glittering tears instantly vanishing. His face contorted into an expression of absolute unadulterated fury. Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel down with explosive, deafening force, his face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson. He pointed the heavy wooden mallet directly at my face, screaming over the chaotic murmurs of the gallery that I was in direct contempt of a standing court order. He commanded the armed bailiffs to cross the room, place me under immediate arrest, and remove my violent presence from his courtroom permanently. The heavy boots of the armed officer closed the distance between us in a matter of seconds. He reached for his steel cuffs, fully prepared to drag me out of the double doors and bury me in the county jail. Before his thick fingers could even graze the fabric of my jacket, a sharp and incredibly commanding voice sliced through the heavy tension of the room. It was Sarah, my chronically exhausted public defender, completely transformed before my eyes. She marched straight down the center aisle, bypassing the gallery barrier with an absolute and unyielding authority. She slammed a thick, freshly bound legal folder directly onto the polished mahogany of the judge's bench. She loudly declared an emergency motion to halt the conservatorship proceedings, immediately, citing the discovery of new and irrefutable material evidence directly related to the underlying criminal investigation of the vehicle crash. Judge Harrison recoiled slightly, his face twisting in profound confusion. He angrily demanded to know what on earth a municipal public defender thought she was doing, interrupting a closed family court ruling. Sarah did not flinch under his judicial wrath. She stood her ground and calmly informed the court that this motion was not being filed solely by her municipal office. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber. Greg stepped forward from the deep shadows of the hallway. He wore a sharp and dark federal suit, a gold state attorney general investigator badge clipped prominently to his belt. He did not say a single word, but his mere physical presence in the room sent an immediate and terrifying shockwave through the Sterling family. Local judges could easily be bought with country club memberships and massive campaign donations, but state-level investigators operating under federal oversight were an entirely different and incredibly dangerous breed. The pristine and untouchable facade of my brother-in-law completely shattered in less than 5 seconds. Trent sprang from his plush leather chair with such violent force that it tipped backward and crashed loudly against the wooden railing. His face, usually a mask of smug superiority, instantly drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly and terrifying shade of pale gray. His elite legal instincts kicked into sheer survival overdrive. He began shouting frantically, throwing his arms wildly into the air. He aggressively objected to the motion, screaming about severe protocol violations, lack of proper discovery, and unverified hearsay. He demanded that the judge strike the sudden filing from the official record, claiming it was a desperate and illegal stunt orchestrated by a violent criminal trying to manipulate the legal system. Trent paced the floor of the courtroom like a cornered predator, his perfectly tailored suit jacket flying open as he spat rapid-fire legal codes, desperately trying to construct an impenetrable wall of procedural red tape. Richard jumped to his feet as well, his face turning bright red as he joined his son in screaming at the judge. The two men who had just spent the entire morning portraying themselves as weeping, heartbroken relatives were now acting like vicious, cornered animals. Patricia clutched her designer purse to her chest, looking wildly between her husband and her son, her perfectly constructed socialite mask completely slipping to reveal genuine, unfiltered terror. They knew the walls were closing in on them rapidly, and their flawless execution was falling apart. The gallery of wealthy spectators began to whisper nervously among themselves, realizing that the perfect Sterling family was suddenly unraveling right before their very eyes. The absolute chaos in the room reached a fever pitch as Trent continued to yell, entirely abandoning his professional composure in a desperate bid to keep the truth hidden. But Trent had severely miscalculated his audience. Judge Harrison was a man who demanded absolute respect and total decorum in his courtroom. He was accustomed to the smooth, polite, and heavily rehearsed version of Trent Sterling. Watching the high-powered corporate attorney completely lose his mind over a simple evidentiary motion deeply irritated the older magistrate. The blatant hypocrisy of their reaction was a massive red flag. A grieving family should naturally welcome any new information regarding the horrific accident that nearly killed their beloved daughter. Instead, they were fighting with absolute desperation to keep the truth entirely buried. The stark contrast between their previous tears and their current rage was incredibly revealing. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel 3 consecutive times, the sharp cracks echoing loudly across the vaulted ceiling and demanding absolute silence. He glared down at Trent, openly questioning why a man who was allegedly seeking the peaceful medical release of his tragically injured sister was suddenly hyperventilating over the introduction of new facts regarding her accident. The sheer naked panic radiating from Trent was far too obvious to ignore. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating quiet as everyone stared at the unraveling attorney. Trent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely out of options. His legal maneuvers had finally hit a solid brick wall. Judge Harrison sternly overruled the aggressive objection. He declared that given the immense gravity of the decision regarding Claire's life support, he would personally review any new evidence presented by the defense. He turned his severe gaze toward me, pointing a firm finger toward the large digital media cart positioned near the jury box. He ordered me to approach the terminal and present whatever secret I was holding. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold plastic of the universal serial bus drive Greg had prepared for me. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the glowing monitor, fully prepared to detonate the legal bomb that would finally burn their corrupt empire to the absolute ground. The walk across the polished marble floor of the courtroom felt incredibly long, as if the air itself had turned to thick water. Every single eye in the packed gallery tracked my movements. Trent watched me with absolute venom, his earlier frantic panic masked temporarily by a forced glare of indignant outrage. He truly believed I was simply holding a blank drive, performing a desperate final stunt before being dragged away in chains. I reached the wooden media cart positioned precisely next to the empty jury box. My injured hand throbbed beneath its fresh bandage, but my fingers did not shake even a fraction of an inch as I inserted the small plastic drive into the metallic port. Sarah, my exhausted but fierce public defender, leaned over and quickly tapped a sequence of keys on the connected laptop. Above the judge and mounted securely on the side walls for the gallery to view 4 massive flat-screen monitors instantly flickered to life. The ambient whispering and hostile murmurs in the grand chamber completely vanished, replaced by an absolute suffocating silence. The screens illuminated with the crisp, high-definition interior cabin view of Claire's luxury vehicle. A collective breath was drawn by the spectators. Seeing my wife sitting upright, vibrant, and intensely focused sent a sharp ache directly through my chest. Her knuckles were bone white as she gripped the steering wheel, navigating the slick mountain road. A sharp electronic chime rang out loudly through the courtroom speakers, indicating a connected conference call. Then the deeply familiar, patronizing voice of Richard Sterling filled the hushed room. He started to speak about temporary liquidity issues, but Claire completely cut him off. Her voice echoed off the historic wood-paneled walls with a furious, unyielding authority that made several wealthy spectators physically jump in their polished pews. She methodically and explicitly laid out their staggering crimes. She listed the hidden corporate ledgers, the offshore shell accounts, and the deeply falsified escrow transfers. She screamed the exact stolen amount into the microphone, exposing the $4 million deficit. She named Trent, directly, furiously detailing the massive illegal gambling debts that had entirely drained her real estate agency. I watched the devastating impact of her words wash over the courtroom. The powerful real estate developers and country club elite who had just spent the morning actively supporting Richard began to physically recoil. The respected pillars of their affluent community were being brutally unmasked as desperate thieves and corporate embezzlers right before their very eyes. Up on the bench, Judge Harrison slowly lowered his highly polished gold fountain pen. The piece of metal he was about to use to sign Claire's death warrant clattered softly against his wooden desk. His severe, judgmental glare completely shifted from me to the two men sitting frozen at the plaintiff table. The audio continued to blare, capturing Richard begging frantically for his daughter to turn the car around, promising to mortgage his own estate to replace the stolen millions. Then came the chilling sound of Trent snarling violent, panicked threats, demanding she keep her mouth permanently shut to protect the family legacy. With a swift click of the computer mouse, Sarah switched the active visual feed to the rear-facing camera. The monitors now displayed the winding, treacherous mountain pass stretching out behind Claire's accelerating vehicle. The morning sky on the screen was a bleak, overcast gray. For 3 tense seconds, nothing but empty asphalt filled the frame. Then a massive black sport utility vehicle roared into view, violently piercing the mountain fog. There was absolutely no mistaking the aggressive custom grille or the specific vanity license plate. It was Trent driving his signature luxury car. The entire courtroom erupted into a synchronized gasp of pure, unfiltered horror as the black vehicle surged forward with terrifying predatory speed. Trent did not hit his brakes. He did not attempt to swerve or simply intimidate his sister. Over the courtroom speakers, his voice shrieked with a raw, murderous intent that chilled the blood of every single person listening. He commanded his father over the phone line, screaming at the top of his lungs to run her off the road. The next horrifying frame captured the massive black hood of his vehicle slamming brutally into the rear bumper of Claire's car. The sickening, deafening crunch of compressing steel and shattering safety glass blasted through the judicial audio system, violently vibrating the wooden floorboards. The camera spun wildly out of control, recording a terrifying, chaotic blur of gray sky and jagged rocks before the screen snapped violently to pitch black. The silence that immediately followed the digital crash was incredibly heavy, practically suffocating the air out of the grand chamber. Then, total and absolute bedlam erupted. Patricia Sterling let out a high-pitched, guttural scream that completely shattered her carefully constructed socialite facade. Her designer handbag tumbled from her lap, spilling expensive cosmetics across the marble floor as she backed away from her own son in sheer terror. Beside her, Richard gasped loudly for air. His face turned an alarming shade of deep, suffocating purple. He clutched his left arm aggressively across his chest, staggering sideways before collapsing heavily into a wooden chair, completely consumed by a massive, debilitating panic attack. The smug, untouchable aura of the Sterling family dissolved into absolute nothingness in a matter of seconds. Trent remained entirely frozen at the table. The arrogant corporate attorney who had mocked my salary and threatened to erase my existence just days earlier was now staring at the blank monitors with hollow, dead eyes. The terrifying reality of his situation paralyzed him completely. He had just broadcasted his own attempted murder and multi-million-dollar financial fraud to a room filled with the most powerful people in the county. The sheer brutality of the digital footage hung over the courtroom like a thick cloud of toxic smoke. Judge Harrison sat entirely immobilized behind his elevated wooden bench. The color had drained completely from his stern face. He had spent his entire morning casually preparing to hand over a vulnerable woman to a grieving father. He genuinely believed he was executing a highly compassionate legal duty. Now he realized with sickening clarity that he had been expertly manipulated into acting as an unwitting accomplice to a premeditated murder. His jaw tightened in a display of profound and highly visible outrage. He slowly looked past the trembling members of the Sterling family and locked his eyes directly with the man standing confidently at the back of the gallery. Greg offered a single and highly deliberate nod in return. That remarkably small gesture was the ultimate signal to spring the trap. 4 men and 2 women dressed in dark and unassuming business suits instantly stood up from the rear wooden pews. They had spent the entire morning hearing blending in perfectly with the affluent local spectators. Now they moved with a terrifying and highly coordinated military precision that immediately shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Two of the state investigators marched directly toward the heavy double doors at the main entrance. They pulled the massive brass handles shut and firmly engaged the thick iron deadbolts. A loud and heavy click echoed sharply across the silent room. They officially transformed the Grand Judicial Chamber into an inescapable federal holding cell. The remaining undercover agents fanned out quickly. They completely blocked every single aisle and secondary exit. The wealthy crowd of prominent real estate developers and elite country club socialites shrank back in sheer and unadulterated terror. They pressed themselves tightly against the polished oak walls. Trent finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. The brilliant corporate mind that had flawlessly orchestrated my absolute ruin was instantly overridden by a primal and desperate instinct to survive the incoming consequences. He aggressively shoved his own hyperventilating father completely out of his way. He knocked the older man violently to the carpeted floor. Trent completely abandoned his expensive leather briefcase. He leaped over the wooden plaintiff table and sprinted wildly toward the private side exit reserved exclusively for judicial staff. He moved with the sheer and blinding panic of a cornered predator. But the local bailiffs were already moving to intercept. A massive and broad-shouldered court officer lunged forward. He caught the fleeing lawyer just inches from the brass door handle. The officer tackled Trent squarely around his tailored waist. The brutal and unforgiving impact lifted the arrogant attorney completely off the ground. They crashed heavily onto the hard marble floor in a chaotic and tangled mess of flailing limbs and expensive fabric. Trent screamed incoherently. He kicked his Italian leather shoes in a pathetic and desperate attempt to break free. Two more state investigators instantly descended upon him. They pinned his shoulders aggressively to the cold stone tiles. They wrenched his arms violently behind his back. The distinct and metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs clamping down tightly on his bruised wrists rang out like the sweetest music I had ever heard. Simultaneously, Greg quickly approached the defense table where Richard was desperately gasping for oxygen. The untouchable patriarch of the Sterling Empire was currently curled on the ground in the fetal position. His pale face was slick with a terrified and heavy sweat. He reached a trembling hand upward. He weakly pleaded for immediate medical assistance or an elite legal counsel. Greg simply stood over him. He pulled a thick stack of highly official state warrants from his interior jacket pocket. In a loud and incredibly steady voice that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room, Greg officially placed Richard under arrest. He listed a devastating and long litany of severe felony charges. These included massive corporate embezzlement, federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder, and attempting to aggressively manipulate a state judicial proceeding. Another tall investigator hauled the older man roughly to his feet. He slapped a pair of cold metal cuffs securely onto his wrists. Patricia stood a few feet away. She was forced to watch her powerful husband and her golden child being treated exactly like dangerous street criminals. She slid slowly down the wooden gallery bench. She covered her face with her trembling hands and let out a long and pathetic wail of total and inescapable defeat. Her pristine world of luxury luncheons and absolute social dominance was completely eradicated in less than 3 short minutes. Judge Harrison finally found his voice. He stood up from his tall leather chair. His hands were shaking with an unfiltered and righteous fury. He grabbed the emergency conservatorship petition he had been thoroughly prepared to sign just 10 minutes prior. He lifted the document high into the air for the entire stunned courtroom to see. He violently ripped the thick stack of paper directly down the middle. He threw the shredded pieces scattered across his desk like worthless and offensive trash. He leaned heavily over the elevated bench and barked rapid and uncompromising orders to the frantic court stenographer. He legally declared the conservatorship petition completely dismissed with extreme prejudice. He certainly did not stop there. The enraged magistrate immediately addressed the temporary restraining order that Trent had so flawlessly weaponized to banish me from my own life and my own wife. Judge Harrison struck the mandate permanently from the official county record. He explicitly stated out loud that the entire legal filing was built entirely on a toxic foundation of malicious and coordinated perjury. The judge then turned his attention directly to me. His severe and highly judgmental expression softened into a look of profound and genuine regret. He formally addressed the court. He stated clearly that all of my legal and medical rights as a devoted husband were fully and immediately reinstated. The massive and suffocating mountain of fabricated criminal evidence, toxic neighborhood gossip, and aggressive legal barriers that had completely buried me for 18 agonizing days was officially dismantled. The system Trent had so arrogantly claimed to control had just turned around and completely devoured him. I stood tall in the center aisle of the courtroom. I watched the two men who had ruthlessly tried to murder my wife being physically dragged out through the side doors in heavy steel chains. My reputation was finally cleared. My financial and personal dignity was entirely restored. But the incredibly sweet taste of poetic justice was secondary to the singular and burning thought that now consumed my mind. I was completely free to go back to the hospital. I did not stay to watch the state investigators load my father-in-law and brother-in-law into the back of their unmarked federal vehicles. The absolute second Judge Harrison signed the judicial order fully restoring my marital and medical rights, I turned my back on the courtroom and ran. I sprinted down the wide marble steps of the county courthouse, completely ignoring the chaotic swarm of local news reporters desperately shouting questions about the stunning arrest of the city's most powerful real estate family. My battered sedan carried me across town faster than I had ever driven before. I pulled directly into the main drop-off lane of the Central Hospital campus, abandoning my car right by the front curb. When I marched through the automatic sliding glass doors of the massive lobby, the same private security guards who had forcefully thrown me out onto the cold pavement 18 days earlier immediately stepped forward. They recognized my unwashed clothes and bruised face, moving aggressively to intercept me. I did not retreat. I pulled the freshly stamped, heavily embossed court mandate from my jacket pocket and shoved it directly into the chest of the lead guard. He scanned the legal text, his aggressive posture instantly dissolving into a nervous apology. He stepped completely aside, clearing my path to the elevators. I rode up to the fourth-floor intensive care unit, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm of pure, unadulterated relief. Pushing open the heavy wooden door to her private suite, I finally saw Claire. The sterile humming machines and pale fluorescent lights had not changed, but the suffocating aura of impending death was entirely gone. I collapsed into the plastic chair beside her bed and wrapped both of my hands gently around her cold, fragile fingers. For the first time in nearly 3 agonizing weeks, the crushing, paralyzing weight of false guilt and absolute terror finally lifted from my shoulders. I buried my face into her palm and allowed myself to simply breathe. As I sat in the quiet hum of the medical machinery over the next 48 hours, my racing mind slowly began to process the sheer magnitude of the systemic karma that had just decimated the Sterling family. The very legal framework they had so arrogantly weaponized to destroy a simple high school history teacher had completely reversed course to devour them whole. My public defender, Sarah, brought me a fresh cup of coffee the following morning and quietly laid out the devastating aftermath. Trent was currently sitting in a cold, windowless holding cell at the maximum security county lockup. Because he possessed significant offshore bank accounts and presented a massive flight risk, a federal magistrate had firmly denied him bail. The slick corporate attorney who had mocked my cheap suits and promised to erase my existence was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, actively facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in federal prison for attempted murder, witness tampering, and massive corporate fraud. Richard was faring no better. The state attorney general had immediately executed a blanket asset freeze on the entire Sterling financial empire. Federal agents had simultaneously raided his sprawling corporate headquarters and his gated residential compound, seizing every single bank account, investment portfolio, and luxury vehicle he owned to properly secure the stolen $4 million he had siphoned from Claire. The untouchable patriarch was completely ruined, stripped of the wealth he believed made him practically a god. And Patricia, the woman who had shrieked insults at me in this very hospital lobby, was now experiencing her own personal brand of hell. With her husband and son securely locked behind iron bars and all their financial assets heavily frozen by the government, she was rendered utterly penniless overnight. Sarah told me that Patricia had desperately tried to seek refuge with her affluent socialite friends, but the local elite had instantly and completely ostracized her. The country club immediately revoked her membership. Her wealthy neighbors refused to answer their doors. She was left entirely isolated and abandoned, experiencing the exact same brutal, suffocating exile she had so viciously forced upon me. The scales of justice had brutally and efficiently rebalanced the universe. I did not leave Claire's bedside for 2 entire days. I slept in the uncomfortable plastic hospital chair, bathed in the tiny sink, and spoke to her for hours on end. I told her the absolute truth about what had transpired. I recounted every single terrifying night spent freezing in my car, the desperate break-in at the municipal impound lot, and the glorious moment her hidden digital camera exposed the monsters hiding in her family. I promised her that our life was finally safe, completely cleansed of their toxic greed and relentless manipulation. On the late afternoon of the second day, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the quiet room. The steady, rhythmic click of the mechanical ventilator suddenly fell out of sequence. I sat up straight, my eyes darting nervously toward the glowing digital monitors. Claire's heart rate began to climb slightly, moving from a slow, suppressed crawl into a much stronger natural rhythm. I squeezed her hand, my own pulse roaring in my ears. A tiny, fragile movement registered against my palm. Her index finger twitched. It was just a small flutter at first, followed rapidly by a firm, deliberate squeeze. The paralyzing ice surrounding my heart shattered completely. I leaned over the metal bed railing, calling her name in a soft, trembling whisper. The heavy, bruised eyelids that had remained completely sealed for nearly 3 weeks began to flutter. Slowly fighting against the heavy sedatives and the lingering trauma, Claire opened her eyes. The bright, intelligent warmth I loved so deeply was still there, shining clearly through the hazy confusion of the hospital room. She blinked against the harsh lighting, her gaze wandering weakly before finally locking directly onto me. I brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, completely unable to stop the warm tears from streaming down my own exhausted face. I was the very first face she saw, right where I had promised to be, standing firmly on the solid ground we were now going to build our new life upon. 8 long months have passed since the heavy oak doors of that county courtroom slammed shut behind my brother-in-law. The slow changing of the seasons brought a profound sense of renewal to our deeply fractured lives. Claire's medical recovery was nothing short of miraculous, though it demanded an agonizing level of sheer physical grit. We spent countless exhausting hours inside brightly lit physical rehabilitation centers. I stood firmly by her side as she took her very first agonizingly slow steps without the assistance of a metal walker. The exact same fierce, uncompromising determination she used to build her commercial real estate empire was channeled entirely into reclaiming her own broken body. Today she walks with absolutely no trace of the catastrophic injuries that nearly claimed her life on that mountain pass. The dark purple bruises have completely faded, replaced by a radiant, unyielding strength that takes my breath away every single time I look at her. We reclaimed our quiet suburban home, installing brand new locks and leaving the darkness of that terrible winter far behind us. Taking back her luxury real estate agency was an entirely different kind of brutal battlefield. Once the state and federal authorities concluded their sweeping financial investigations, the government officially transferred total executive control back into Claire's highly capable hands. We immediately hired a relentless team of independent forensic accountants to aggressively scour every single ledger, commercial contract, and offshore transfer the Sterling men had poisoned. We surgically excised the deep corporate rot Richard and Trent had deliberately left behind. We fired the complicit board members, permanently severed ties with their corrupt investing partners, and completely restructured the organizational hierarchy based purely on transparency and absolute ethical rigor. Claire's agency did not simply survive the massive public scandal, it genuinely flourished. Freed from the toxic, draining, parasitic weight of her father and brother constantly skimming from her success, the company is now generating record profits. She rebuilt her professional reputation on a solid foundation of absolute honesty rather than relying on the fragile smoke and mirrors of the elite country club circuit. As for my own life, I returned to the exact same high school classroom I had been so ruthlessly banished from. Walking down those familiar tiled hallways felt incredibly different this time around. The very same school board administrators who had frantically rushed to place me on indefinite unpaid leave sent a formal, deeply apologetic letter of official reinstatement. My teaching colleagues and my daily students welcomed me back with an overwhelming display of genuine respect. Even our local suburban neighbors, the people who had tightly drawn their living room curtains and stared at me with pure disgust, while I froze in my car, now avert their eyes in profound, lingering shame whenever I checked the morning mail. I did not pack up and move away to escape the memory. I did not attempt to change my career path. I simply went back to being a highly dedicated American history teacher. But no one looks at me as a weak, easily manipulated target anymore. They look at me as a man who walked completely unarmed into the darkest, most terrifying valley of the local legal system and completely dismantled an untouchable giant. Through this entire horrific ordeal, I learned a deeply fundamental lesson about how the modern world actually operates. We are constantly conditioned by society to believe that immense wealth and aggressive social influence possess the absolute power to bend reality. Men like Richard and Trent Sterling navigate our world with a terrifying level of unchecked arrogance because they genuinely believe their massive bank accounts provide permanent immunity from consequence. They assume that if they can afford the most ruthless corporate lawyers and comfortably buy the favor of local magistrates, they can simply overwrite the objective truth to fit their own selfish narratives. They look down at quiet, ordinary people who simply play by the rules, individuals who value basic family loyalty over rapid corporate expansion, and they fatally mistake that quiet decency for weakness. They believe honest men are nothing more than fragile, temporary obstacles waiting patiently to be crushed under the heavy wheels of their expensive luxury vehicles. They mistake volume and intimidation for actual strength. But reality does not ever bow to money. The truth is incredibly patient. It does not need to scream for attention in a crowded hospital lobby, and it certainly does not need to wear a $5,000 tailored suit in a court of law. The truth operates exactly like the deep, unseen concrete foundation of a massive skyscraper. When the weather is perfectly clear and the sky is blue, everyone exclusively admires the shining glass windows and the glittering gold exterior. No one ever pays any attention to the silent, unmoving pillars buried deep underground. But when the violent storms finally roll in, when the devastating earthquake eventually hits and the ground splits wide open, all of that expensive glass shatters into a million worthless pieces. The beautiful, towering facade collapses instantly into absolute dust. When the violent shaking finally stops and the thick smoke completely clears, that quiet, invisible foundation is the only thing left standing in the rubble. My father-in-law and brother-in-law built a towering, magnificent castle entirely out of lies, and they completely destroyed themselves trying to defend it against a simple piece of hidden plastic. If you have ever had your character brutally assassinated by people who thought they were completely untouchable, you deeply know the suffocating pain of carrying a false blame. You know the exact agony of standing in silence while liars control the narrative of your life. Do not engage their toxic lies. Keep quiet, meticulously gather your undeniable proof, and let the undeniable truth do all the destroying for you. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of justice served.